Time for Type 40, your Doctor Who podcast from the Spacebook for the Fandom Podcast Network. With me, Dan Hadley, Birmingham's King of the Geeks, your designated driver and mouth runner, materialising again here with Doctor Who conversation on our free-speaking, big-thinking show for everyone. That's whatever decade or century you started watching, reading or listening along to those ongoing adventures of our hero, Doctor Who. We chat about it all on this show, and who knows, there may even be a few laughs along the way. So come and step into our TARDIS and share this journey together here with us in Doctor Who's 60th anniversary year on Type 40. Snaffling another 90 minutes of your time and space, or space and time, whichever order. I'm never really sure what order that's supposed to be in, actually. But yeah, we're doing it, whatever it is, and we're hurtling back through the both, really, as the anniversary year takes flight here. And a new Doctor Who on the television, well, there's not much of that, is there, sadly, but there's lots and lots to look back on here for our Diamond Review season of classic and new Doctor Who stories as we approach that all-new era. There's each and every single era, I think, has got little nuggets, as well as the things that we rewatch over and over again, and that we see reviews and articles about over and over again. There are lots of little nuggets tucked away that maybe have passed you by for a couple of years, maybe even a couple of decades. So that's what we're going to get stuck into in this sort of umbrella series here. And we have a classic series tale getting the Type 40 treatment. This time, I've got just the fellow travellers to sort of break it down with me and to crack the codes on the walls and navigate the corridors of BBC Television Centre in the 1970s, as befits classic series Doctor Who and that 1974 serial, Death to the Daleks, in particular. So who's here? Who have I got? Well, first of all, is my regular co-host and my dear friend. I've got Simon Horton back on Type 40. Here he is.
Well, hello there. It's lovely to be back talking about classic Who. Everybody knows that I am a classic fan above everything else, and so it's brilliant to be. I can never ever get bored of talking classic Who, quite frankly. So it's good to be here.
You've mentioned it a couple of times, and I like how in your backdrop at the moment, you look like you're lit by a CRT back in 1974, 75, the flickering light of a television screen there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got my TARDIS, and I've got my Dalek up there, the talking Daleks. It wasn't quite released in 1974. It's a few years later than that, but never mind. It's as close as you're going to get, seeing as there weren't any 1974 Daleks out at that point, so it's as close as you're going to get.
They had a period, an off time, didn't they? An off period. But it's a bit dark in here in the TARDIS itself this time, isn't it? Do you think this is just, it's topical with the cost of living crisis, and that's what's going on in the TARDIS there?
Well, it was very topical at the time because of all of the power cuts that were going on back then in 1974. That's, of course, why they did it. And now, of course, it's topical again now because none of us can afford to turn on the lights or turn on the heating. So
this is why we get him on, everybody, because I hadn't joined the dots there.
Actually, not.
Of course, yeah. Well, I remember power cuts. I was very, very young in the 70s, and this does predate me. But I do remember the power cuts and the 3-day weeks and the misery and all that sort of stuff. We've never been happier in Britain, have we, than when we're suffering?
Well, we get a chance to moan, don't we? And that's what Britons do best, is moan.
I think you could be right. But yeah, I think that's our component part of things, sort of almost certain to raise its head at some point, ranting and raving. But we do have a balancing act about to enter the fray. We're being graced by one of the Time Lords themselves, making his debut on Type 40. And if you're a listener to Doctor Who on audio, and let's be honest, who isn't, a big finish, you may have already heard him as the newest actor to take to the mic as the very first incarnation of the Doctor in a whole line of brand new audio adventures. So he's an actor and a voice artist, but more importantly for us tonight, he's a lifelong Doctor Who fan. Stephen Noonan, welcome to the show.
Hello there. I'm delighted to be here.
Welcome. It's lovely to have you here.
And talking about my first Doctor, as it were, the third Doctor. And
was that who you grew? I'm guessing we are of a similar age, and so did you grow up with Jon Pertwee? Fall in love with Tom Baker? But
precisely, Simon. Precisely. I think we may be of quite a similar vintage. I've got a sense that I think I've heard you mention in some of the collaborations I've seen you both do that your first memory was the Demons. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. I was 3 years old at the time, and I remember Bot from the Demons. What is your earliest memory? Also, Jon Pertwee. Then,
well, yeah, Jon Pertwee, but not the Demons. My very first memory is the Sea Devil burning through the door in episode 2 of the Sea Devils, and running into the kitchen and telling my mother that I was too frightened to stay in the room with the television. And that was so potently frightening. And what's interesting about our discussion tonight is that Michael Edwin Bryant, who directed the Sea Devils, had a thing about hands. So the whole of the first episode of the Sea Devils, all you see is the hand grabbing the microphone, the beginning, the first sight of it, and coming up over the lifeboat, coming through the bars of the Seafort window, and coming through the door, of course. But that's episode 2, and you get that it's a sort of motif in this story as well. The hands.
Now you've said
the first sight of the Exelon you see in episode 1 of this story. The hand on the rock, the hand creeping across the floor towards Sarah. Later on, Belal's hand, you know.
I've never noticed. You could write a thesis on Michael E. Bryant.
And I had a recurring nightmare as a child that I was in our kitchen and my parents weren't in the house, and one of the drawers, you know, which held the cutlery, but it was a place where there wasn't a drawer, there was a blank one, but that blank one in the dream started to open, and there was a hand inside it that was sort of creeping towards the edge of and I ran out and I was closing the doors, and I knew it was going to be able to, whatever it was going to be able to burn through the doors.
Wow.
So potent things about Doctor Who in the Pertwee are hands and burning through doors, of course, because you got the Sea Devil does it, the Ogrons that also terrified me, Frontier in Space,
yes, they do it,
burning through the door, the Daleks burning through the door in Planet of the Daleks, which of course is an echo back to the first story, you know. Yeah. So these are all sort of vivid, powerful memories.
Well, Jerry Anderson used to do things like that in his shows quite a lot, and he used to do a lot of handwork as well, didn't he? So mainly so you didn't have to use the strings.
But I think it's interesting because by the sounds of it, I'm suspecting your sort of engagement with Doctor Who in those early years is very similar, if not identical to mine, because the Tom Baker stories, I can remember very, very clearly the whole story in many cases. Whereas the Jon Pertwee I'm the same as you. I just remember moments, scenes.
Exactly.
And interestingly, the hand in burning through the door into the Sea Devils that's one of those moments that is ingrained on my memory as well. So clearly, that was a really good moment because it affected us both.
Exactly, and also, you know, it's the other trappings around the things like what was so powerful at that time was the dedication of Barry Letts and his directors. When he's saying to anybody who's coming on board, you treat this like it's the play for today, or the Wednesday play, or whatever it is. So everybody's treating it with complete and utter seriousness, and the actors are playing it 100% to the limits of their conviction. And so it's the hand thing is there, but there's Pertwee's extraordinary ability to communicate hysterical alarm on his face, you know. So his face would communicate the fear to the audience. And of course, Katie Manning's brilliant ability, and Liz Sladen later on, to communicate the sort of the fear that we were feeling.
Yes.
But also the job that other people like Malcolm Clark's music in the Sea Devils, which I always say is like somebody boring into your brain with a drill where you're on a bad acid trip. You know?
You often describe it as boring into your brain, don't you? As getting deep, the soundtracks and the incidental musics and things like that. Exactly.
Because I must be honest, I love the soundtrack for the Sea Devils, and it's coming for a lot of stick, but it's a work of genius, I think.
I think it is a great work of avant-garde genius, but it's a great work of musically scaring the little buggers to death, to coin a phrase, you know.
Because it's so unhinged, isn't it? It's very unhinged.
Well, it just terrified me because that story is more vividly remembered to me than the other, because it was repeated twice in the 70s, which makes it unique, I think, for being, because there was the Christmas repeat, and I'll never forget the lad around the corner, David Williams, coming around saying Doctor Who's on, and this would often, because we never knew what was going on, did we? You know, suddenly, because you know there was so little publicity, and so having to put the TV, and then one May Day morning in 1974, being around at my cousin Ian's, playing out in sunshine. And my Auntie Sheila, who was a bit of a joker, came out into the garden and said, "Hey, Doctor Who's on?" And we both went, "Oh, no, it isn't." She goes, "No, it is. It's the Sea Devils." And I thought, how could she know the title? And there was this sort of dawning realization and this unbelievable excitement running in. I don't know what had been the cricket had been cancelled.
It was the cricket had been rained off.
And there was this extraordinary repeat of the Sea Devils. I think that was between episodes 4 and 5 of Planet of the Spiders. I've got a feeling it was, and there was.
We're all over the map already.
I know,
gents.
I know. You want to get this done in 2 hours?
we're going to do our best. Now, you and I have spoken before, haven't we, Stephen? And back then, I was staggered by your memory regarding the classic show. But you've been playing the Doctor on audio for a little while now, haven't you? We're not going to be pressing you for spoilers and embargoes on all of that. I was going to say to you, obviously, there's no script.
Don't mention the war machines. Yeah.
There's no script this time, but it's obviously not going to be a problem for Stephen Noonan, is it?
No. And
I'll tell you what, this must have been a tough day at work. So,
well, you want to ask your friend the rabbi about that, because when he does reviews, he talks more about Lauren than he talks about anything else.
Yes, I think he's probably her greatest fan. So it's more on that in due course, but on our focus this time is on the 70s, as luck would have it, with these two aboard and the third Doctor. So Jon Pertwee, he was cast as a third Doctor in the summer of 1969, just as his predecessor's final story was reaching its slow, gradual end. Obviously, I think it was like week 7 of the War Games, something like that. And the newspapers of the day, they feasted on the news of the series reinvention, and that the central character would be remanifest again in the form of this enigmatic actor. He was familiar from the stage, from cinema, but most notably radio. Jon Pertwee was an incredibly versatile voice talent and sort of a household name after playing the role of the chief petty officer, wasn't he, on the Navy Lark. He'd been doing that for well over 10 years at that point. And as I say, the idea that somebody could be a household name off the back of radio, I think that's quite an alien idea now. Even DJs, people sort of forget who they are. But Pertwee would remain on the Navy Lark until long after he'd finished on Doctor Who as well. But in taking up the TARDIS key, if you like, the 50-year-old actor found a great challenge in effectively stepping out from under the funny accents and the false moustaches to play the hero in a family fantasy adventure serial that had its own place, Simon, in not just the TV schedules, but as almost part of the average British family, wasn't it?
It was, but I mean, what we've got to remember is that by the end, towards the end of the Patrick Troughton years, it was dwindling. Popularity was dwindling. Viewing figures were dipping, and it was at that point really at an all-time low, which is kind of odd when we think about it, because we all love Patrick Troughton. We love the Patrick Troughton years, and I don't think that's that they didn't resonate with the public. I think it's just that it had been on television at that point for sort of 5-6 years. That was a long time for a series in those days, and so I think it was just slightly dwindling popularity. And of course, what's odd then when Jon Pertwee comes on board is that, as you say, Dan, he was known purely for comedy. I think I'm right in saying probably at that point he wasn't known for any straight.
I think this was his first straight role.
So he was only known for comedy. And so imagine how sort of blindsiding it was for the audience to tune into season 7 expecting Jon Pertwee to be Jon Pertwee, and you get this very, very, apart from some of the Spear from Space, which is a bit more comedic, but only slightly. But the rest of the season is really hard hitting straight down the line, and that must have been quite shocking for the audience of the day, to expect one thing from Pertwee and get something entirely different. And because they didn't know whether he would make it work or not, they were ready to ditch the show after season 7.
Yeah, it's safe to say that Doctor Who's fortunes had been better, Stephen. The show was only really making it through to colour and to the 1970s at all, because the BBC simply couldn't think of anything else to replace it with, could they? And Pertwee himself, he had his own doubts, didn't he? But he remained quite pragmatic and quite professional about it. And I don't know if he knew that he'd been gifted something as such in the way that people would now, but he was open-minded to the challenge, it would seem, and maybe charmed a little too by the belief that Barry Letts had in him, and Derek Sherwin, obviously.
Yeah. Well, it didn't Barry Letts start looking for another show, didn't it? About an Australian sort of Crocodile Dundee sort of prequel, not prequel, but sort of foreshadowing that sort of story, wasn't it? Was it called Snowy Black or something? I think
he was. I mean, Barry Letts, was sort of. He was told by the BBC to find a replacement for Doctor Who. So Barry Letts and Terence Dicks spent most of the time making season 7, also readying another series for if Doctor Who was shelved. Remarkable when you think about it. But they were tasked with finding a replacement for Doctor Who while they were making Doctor Who.
So while Pertwee's making Ambassadors of Death, Inferno, etc., he must have been aware that this was probably a short-lived gig at the time.
And when you think about it, Stephen, that was pretty brave of him thus to take on the role, because it wouldn't have done his career much good if Doctor Who had finished with him in the role after just 1 year. So it's a brave decision, really, of his to take it on, I think.
Yeah, and an extraordinary decision to, it would seem, and a number of people I know who are slightly older than me were very dubious about Jon Pertwee as a choice of Doctor, because he was known almost exclusively for comedy. Yeah, and then the great surprise, the astonishing surprise, that he's probably the straightest of them all, actually, isn't he? I mean, after, as you say, after there's a little bit of comedy in which he deplored himself. He said he couldn't look at those who he hated the scene in the Duc d'Orléans shower, as he refers to it, and the
trying on of the clothes. He
hates that as well. Yeah. But after
and yet it's quite vaudeville, isn't it? I think I'd file that under hijinks.
Yeah.
But you really never see it again.
No. I mean, they don't stand out as being particularly. They don't jar, do they? Those scenes. The only things that he refines or gets rid of, I think, in the early films is the gurning. You know, the gurning faces that he does when he's being strangled by the Nestine octopus, and there's a little bit in the Doctor Who and the Silurians, and I think because, unlike Tom Baker, who claimed he never used to watch it and left it all to intuition, Pertwee always watched himself, and he probably saw himself doing that and thinking, "No, that doesn't work," and excised that from the performance. But I think, and I'm slightly biased because I suppose he is my Doctor. He's certainly my first Doctor. I don't think he ever puts a foot wrong very soon after that. There's almost never a moment when he isn't absolutely on point.
Bang on the money.
Bang on the money, yeah.
And you're right, Stephen, in what you said earlier, in that he had a brilliant ability to convey the fear that we were supposed to feel ourselves.
There are certain doctors that different doctors have different sort of specialities. One of Pertwee's was that ability, like the moment we were talking about earlier with the Sea Devil coming through the door, an astonishing level of not fear, but a communication that what I am looking at is the most terrifying thing in the universe. You know?
Correct. And it's just sheer focus, isn't it? It's like a laser beam. It's 100% focused on that moment, and it keeps you in it. And in a way that somebody like Tom Baker, to me, doesn't. Much as I love Tom Baker, he doesn't have that same ability, because he has more of somehow a detachment from it. He's more somber faced, Tom is, and so he stays in the moment in a very serious, somber way, whereas Pertwee absolutely transmits that fear that used to engage me as a child.
That's right. It's the alarm. Pertwee can do alarm. What Baker does brilliantly, and I've just been rewatching Genesis of the Daleks for another discussion. I think Baker, more than anybody else, can do agony, cliffhanger agony.
Yes.
Episode 3, when he's being electrocuted on underneath the Thal. Underneath the Thal rocket, or when he's being strangled by the Dalek embryo, which was a made up on the spur of the moment cliffhanger, because Maloney it wasn't working, was it? It was going to be with the wires.
That's right.
Said, I tell you what, just grab one of these, put it around, and it's superb. And he sells the fact that he's just holding these pieces of plastic around his neck, and you believe that extraordinary agony. You know,
but I think the other thing with Pertwee is he just brought that gravitas, as you know, gravitas is just essential to the role of the Doctor.
It's peculiar when it comes to Jon Pertwee, though, Simon, because here is somebody who he'd been in entertainment by the time he took up Doctor Who. He'd been doing it for like 20 years. I mean, 30 if you count his time before he went into the Royal Navy. So he'd always been sort of entertaining, and he came from a kind of theatrical background, didn't he? I know his family situation was quite complicated, wasn't it? But he had an extraordinary life, and even up until a few years ago, we were still finding out new things about Jon Pertwee, that he worked in the Secret Service and all these other things. An extraordinary life, one long-lived, and I always get the impression, as you've just described, that charisma, that he just had that naturally. Some people have it and some don't. I think actually everybody who's played the Doctor on screen has had that. Well, nearly everybody. But so everybody has had that. But I think that and you think, well, is there a typical person that would be almost destined to play the Doctor? And you look at the backdrops of Tom compared to John, and they're all so wildly different. Jon Pertwee's background couldn't be any more different than Tom's or Peter's. It was an extraordinary life, and to become a household name off Radio 2, where people couldn't see him, and yet to look like this, really good-looking man, and obviously with a very emotive face, natural charisma. It's almost as if the part was waiting for him, and yet it had been on for 7 years. And you can almost forget that when you watch Spearhead from Space.
But I mean, also, we've got to remember that it was a very, very brave decision of Derek Sherwin to cast him, because of the fact that he was so well known for comedy. It was, you wonder what Derek Sherwin was thinking. Was Derek Sherwin expecting Doctor Who to suddenly move into comedy territory? Well, of course, Patrick Troughton had brought elements of comedy, but it certainly wasn't comical. And so I just think Derek Sherwin made a huge leap there by casting Pertwee.
And I suppose that Sherwin, when he was working on it with Troughton, he was kind of innovating and trying different things. Troughton, even though Troughton was about to leave, I don't think Troughton ever stopped trying to innovate with the part either. And Letts and Pertwee probably benefited from that when it came to this quite drastic at the time reinvention of the show, with a kind of Quatermassy kind of vibe. So that the Doctor's exiled to Earth. He's in the employ of UNIT for the most part, helping fight off alien threats and thwarting the mad scientists, all that kind of thing. So it proved exactly right for the times, Simon. Earlier on we talked about the power cuts and things like that, but there were lots of things making it through to the press around that time, whether about new scientific discoveries and evolution. And all manner of things in sort of similar way that there are now. But so that was what the series itself had one eye on, whereas Pertwee himself, he brought the version of himself that he'd never been allowed to be on screen or on the air or on the airwaves. And he could bring the Bond as well, because he was clearly a big fan of the Bond films and books. So he brought that, and yet he managed to remain and to make the Third Doctor, more importantly, to make the Third Doctor still to be avuncular and to sometimes be petulant and childish too, and alien as well. But he's next to unflappable, isn't he? In that Inverness cape and the frilly shirts, he's next to unflappable in the face of danger, and you only get the odd flicker on his face. And when you see a tremor in Pertwee's face, then you know that the S is really going to hit the fan. And it's different actors are going to respond to it in different ways. But that's something that I've only quite recently seen in his performance. It's taken me several years to get on the level with this
Dan,
incarnation of the character.
What's your first memory of Pertwee? Because I think you're of the Baker generation, aren't you?
I am.
Tom Baker generation. Yeah.
My earliest memory of Jon Pertwee is watching Carnival of Monsters during the Five Faces of Doctor Who.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because that was extraordinary for us, those of us who grew up with Pertwee, because we hadn't seen him since Planet of the Spiders, because of the way that it was impossible to, because there were no video machines, and because I wrote my first letter to the BBC requesting repeats in 1976.
Wow!
And I got a letter back from Sheila Mullins (brackets Miss), and she said, "Thank you, dear Stephen. Thank you for your letter and clever drawing." Because I'd drawn a lot of Doctor Who characters in this. She said, unfortunately, now this must have been it would have been just after season 13 finished. Mm-hmm. So she said, unfortunately, for various reasons, we will not be able to repeat any of these stories, largely because they are in the process of being wiped, being destroyed, to make room in the archives, and also because of contractual agreements with Actors Equity, we are not able to show stories, any episodes of anything more than 3 years old. Mm-hmm. However, she said, there will be a repeat of The Seeds of Doom this summer. There wasn't. Anyway, but she lied. But the point of that letter, of course, was the dawning of the realization of what was actually happening to all this stuff. Not only did I write to Sheila Mullins Miss, the BBC, I also wrote to a certain television program that people don't talk so much about these days. Which
I can imagine which one we're talking about.
Yes. I'd rattle my jewelry if I had some.
You would indeed.
And requesting, this would have made great television, wouldn't it? Me watching loads of old Doctor Who episodes as a fix-it, you know. But I listed them all because of course, where is it? Various. I've got the Radio Times special here somewhere. Which was, of course, did you have the Radio Times special, Simon?
I didn't have the Pertwee one. I didn't have the 10th Radio Times special, only the 20th, because I wasn't even aware in those days. Well, I remember watching the Three Doctors very clearly, again vividly. So when it came to the repeat of that, that was revisiting a show that I could remember. Couldn't remember Carnival of Monsters at all, but I could certainly remember the Three Doctors.
That's very interesting because I'll often say, because of the recent work I've been doing, that I remember the Three Doctors. Well, I do remember the Three Doctors, but I don't remember the old man on the script. Well, I remember an old man on it, but I didn't know who he was. My memories of the Three Doctors, my most vivid memory of the Three Doctors, is the gel coming out of Dr. Tyler's machine and zapping him, accompanied by some particularly sort of potent Dudley Simpson music, and going into the sink and being very wary of our kitchen and bathroom sink after this experience. But that's at this time, until Carnival of Monsters is the first story I remember almost every episode vividly of. And episode 2 was the first episode I ever saw in colour round at my grandmother's, because we had a black and white telly until episode 4, Revenge of the Cybermen. So I remember very well from Carnival of Monsters onwards. But this, so I've got it here. This is the which a lad called Jonathan O'Brien brought his copy into school during this season. So I associate round about the time of Death to the Daleks with seeing this for the first time, and seeing and becoming aware that this program had a history for the first time in season 11, because when the trailers would hit on Friday and the link person would say, tomorrow evening the Doctor and Joe face a new threat, it was the Doctor and Joe. And as far as I was concerned, it had always been the Doctor and Joe, and it would always be the Doctor and Joe. That was I didn't know about the other Doctors, and then this introduced me to that. And I didn't have a copy of this, and I sent off another thing. I sent off for a copy of that. I think I got it round about the beginning of season 12, the beginning of Tom Baker, to have a copy.
I suppose at that point, though, Stephen, the only things that had been commercially available in print were very much about now, weren't they? So if an annual came out, it would be about the current Doctor. Things like that. That was the first publication to, as you say, oh, here's a history, here's almost like a document of something to speak of legacy. We now call it legacy, even though it was 10 years. It doesn't seem like a great deal of time.
Well, even the trailer for the Three Doctors, if you look at it, it says tomorrow evening the Doctor and Joe face a new threat, the Gels. Doesn't mention the Three Doctors at all. You know, that's the bloody anniversary story. You know,
more innocent times, weren't they? And they used this opportunity and this actor. I don't know how hungry he was, but I think the deeper that he got into the part, the more confident, comfortable he appeared to be. I think he got deeper into the psychology almost of the Doctor, who I know that some people have said the Doctor's quite a two-dimensional character who always largely responds in the same way. I don't think that Pertwee saw it like that. And I liked that balance, that he can sometimes be incredibly, seemingly arrogant and not appear to care, and yet to be so paternal towards his companions in particular, and so exasperated with the Brigadier one minute, and yet value his friendship and trust his judgment implicitly the next. I think it's a fascinating take on the character that was probably a little too subtle for me when I first saw him. I found the Third Doctor the hardest to get to know. That was despite the repeat. So I saw Carnival of Monsters, and then The Curse of Peladon, and then the Five Doctors, which I've had in my life sort of forever. You'd have
been, because I think you said in our first chat that your first memory was the Rebos operation. Is that right? Or one of the first one you remember very vividly as a child?
It's one of the first ones. Yeah. But all my memories sort of come from Tom. Yeah, I don't remember watching Pertwee. In fact, I'm certain that I didn't.
So you must have been used to a more comedic take on the role, I suppose.
Yeah,
and perhaps saw that as being, you know, what it was about. So, and Pertwee, of course, early Baker is much straighter, and of course is one of my favorite Tom Baker. But yeah, it must be quite a culture shock if you're used to something that's got a lot of comedy in it. Yeah,
I couldn't see the Doctor in Pertwee's choices, in his aura, in his physicality. I couldn't see him the way that other people could. The karate chopping, the dandiness, the gadgets, working for the military. I wouldn't say I ever thought, this isn't Doctor Who, but I certainly couldn't get a grasp of it. Wow. It took quite a long time.
So maybe it is something that you need to see in context, because we were kids at the time, and we were watching it for what it was, and of course at the time we were watching it for the monsters. That's what you loved about Doctor Who at that age, and so maybe it's the case that we almost fell in love with the Third Doctor incidentally because we were watching for the Daleks and the Sea Devils and all that kind of stuff. Whereas you, Dan, were coming from a more sort of slightly more analytical approach because you were that bit older.
I'd latched on to that central character. That's what it was. I'd latched on really, really hard. Well, particularly to Peter Davison. So when I started to discover the era in piecemeal fashion, obviously it was sort of dripping through to me. But he was still at odds with what Peter had done and what Tom had done. I think the Colin's choices were kind of lining up in some ways, not in others. So
it is difficult because in a way, when you look at Jon Pertwee's performance, there are elements in it of, for example, the Sixth Doctor, that abrasiveness, as you just said, when he was very argumentative and irritated by the Brigadier, for example. There's all that. Well, certainly in the early years, it obviously mellowed as the time went on. But in the early years, there was a great deal of friction between the Doctor and the Brig in particular. And so there is that abrasive quality that actually comes to the fore with the Sixth Doctor. And so I've never really thought about it before, but I can see what you're saying, that sometimes those kind of abrasive choices can make it harder to relate to the character, but it didn't. Maybe I was just too young at that point.
You know what I think part of it was as well, Simon? The fact that Jon Pertwee, to me, was Wurzel Gummidge, and Jon Pertwee was also Jon Pertwee, because the man was a familiar face on British television, on things like Blankety Blank and chat shows and things like that. So I kind of knew him already. He wasn't the mysterious alien Stephen. He was kind of a celebrity with a small c, and he used to go on these shows and he'd talk about his time on Doctor Who. I think part of me, I didn't realize it was the same show, and I've got an example here to play for you now of Pertwee doing his razzle dazzle, maybe you should say, something like that.
John, why do we all love creepy crawlies and monsters?
Oh, it's fantasy, isn't it? It's what the what the children said. They revel in it, all the blood and the guts and the gore.
They are bloodthirsty lot,
Of course they are. Yes, they love it. I mean, all children used to watch monsters. When they watched Doctor Who, they used to hide under the table or behind a chair. But you try to put them outside the door, they'd object very strongly.
We just love being frightened, don't we? We carry this on into adulthood, I suppose.
Of course, yes.
Of course, you were involved with the odd nasty and horror yourself, were you not? In your persona as Doctor Who. I've often wondered, when you were making those things, I mean, television studios are so false in a sense, but were you ever frightened yourself by anything that happened to you in making that series?
No, not really. It's very hard to be frightened by cardboard and tin, and with a chap inside it that you just had lunch with. But,
well, I'm afraid we're not going to frighten you tonight, because we have something of a surprise for you, and we thought you were going to fall off the back of your chair and all that. We've actually got a Dalek, you said the chap you just sort of had lunch with.
Oh, there he is. It's Fred, yes.
Greetings to the humanoid Doctor.
That is
Jon Pertwee.
That is the voice of John Scott Martin. I'd recognize it anywhere. Am I right?
Jon
That's Dalek.
Pertwee, as usual, is right.
We weren't exactly alarmed. Thank you very much indeed, John. You weren't exactly frightened. You see, I've always found those terrifying.
I refuse to be frightened of something that's made of tennis balls, cardboard, and sink pumps, which Nick Briggs has never forgiven him for saying, and of course, you know, he did despise the Daleks.
Yeah.
What was most heartbreaking for me was not discovering that he wasn't frightened of the Daleks. I didn't have any respect for them, and tapping in very much to Dan's explanation as to why it was perhaps difficult to acclimatize himself to the Pertwee Doctor, was the morning after the broadcast of one of the repeats of Carnival of Monsters, going to the bus stop and some kids slightly younger than me talking about telly the night before, and one of them went, did you see Wurzel Gummidge trying to be Doctor Who last night? I thought, oh my God, of course. They all think he's Wurzel Gummidge.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go, no. He's not Wurzel, he's Doctor Who. There it is. And of course, it's interesting that has been an entry point for some people who liked Wurzel Gummidge and then found that they became fond of his Doctor because they liked Wurzel Gummidge. But
in the same,
but it alienated others like Dan, I think.
Yeah.
But of course, as far as I was concerned, you know, Doctor Who was Jon Pertwee because I didn't know any other, and there were almost never any interviews with him. I think there was the one where he went on with the Who-mobile on Blue Peter, and I think he appeared with the Who-mobile on Billy Smart's Circus or something. But until the series Who Done It, he wasn't regularly known to our generation for being anything Doctor Who. So the illusion wasn't spoilt.
And of
by
course, the thing
by
to remember
scarecrow.
is the thing to remember is that following on from that is that at that time in the mid-70s, he was absolutely huge as Doctor Who.
As Doctor Who,
You know, that I do remember.
Yeah.
He was very prevalent. You're right. You were just aware that this man was Doctor Who. And again, I'm the same as you. I didn't know that. I remember my parents sort of dimly saying that there'd been other doctors before Jon Pertwee, and I kept grilling them and saying, well, who were they, what were they? They hadn't got a clue. And so it was Jon Pertwee to me.
I think it's safe to say that Pertwee's career was never the same again. It's as you say, so people got used to seeing him as him, maybe, and maybe he became more comfortable with it. I don't know. I mean, I interviewed Alex from the Who Shop last year, and she talked very generously about her personal relationship with Jon and how he suffered terribly with stage fright. And yet you would never think it when you see him walk onto the stage on Wogan and stuff like that with his chest pumped right the way up and speaking in such a commanding way. He appears unflappable then. So the idea that Pertwee could suffer with stage fright, I've always found that fascinating since Alex told me about it.
It's compensation, isn't it? A lot of performers are like that. You know, there's and Katie Manning, I think, in the interview she does on one of the Blu-rays, talks about how his vulnerability, his sensitivity, how he was easily hurt, you know, how he was easily offended, and there's this huge kind of theatrical front, which a lot of actors masking, veiling, masquerading their sort of their fragile, you know, their sort of timidity underneath it all. But what was one more thing about Pertwee in the immediate aftermath of Doctor Who? I think it was the first series of it was between seasons 11 and 12 was a series called Who Done It. But the persona he had in Who Done It was very like the Doctor when he presented it. In fact, he'd say, "Welcome to another series of Who Done It," or if you prefer it, Doctor Who Done It. He'd say, it was like he, as the Doctor, was presenting it. The persona
you're right. And I remember as a kid just being absolutely thrilled by Who
absolutely
Done It, because as a kid, I did feel like Doctor Who was presenting it. It was, as you say, Stephen, a very similar persona. And it was just really thrilling to see this man who I adored at that point on another program, and I didn't quite understand why at that age that there's a separation between the actor and the character. So he was Doctor Who present, and the fact that it was called Who Done It,
I know, perfect.
They tapped into that, obviously. Of course, they knew what they were doing.
That's
all that the involvement with Doctor Who, the Doctor certainly revolutionized Jon Pertwee's career, I think, and sent him off in a different trajectory to one that he could ever have predicted, one that would last for the rest of his days. He became instantly identifiable with both the Doctor and Wurzel Gummidge, and he would remain so. The third Doctor himself undoubtedly initiated a rebirth of interest in the series, even if it would mean that Pertwee would have to cross paths with the Daleks at some point, who did bore him to tears. We all know about that, and we're going to get stuck into it in a couple of minutes. That's after I remind you that if you'd like to do some real-time traveling of your own, each and every edition of this show, past, present, and future, is just a tap or two away on the device of your choice, but only if you know where to look. There's a wealth of reviews, previews, interviews, geek outs, and deep dives with all our regular panelists and some pretty awesome guests. We know there's something for every fan over at type40.podbean.com. More about that later on, as well as a junction where we'll make contact with the matrix of all knowledge that we call the Fandom Podcast Network. We're going to have a word about all the other shows and treats for the ears. They're on offer over there as well. My God. Where to start? Yes, so we're going to pull to open now, and maybe we'll light the way to it. Looks quite treacherous out there. We've got a whole alien world to find our way through, and a big chunk of classic Doctor Who to get stuck into. Okay, don't go away. The classic series of Doctor Who, obviously on screen for 26 whole seasons. Some stayed longer than others. I think some try to forget, where others knew that probably it was a fool's errand, Simon. But with Jon Pertwee, his relationship to the character and to the series, I think was a little choppy. He'd stayed in the series for 5 seasons, hadn't he? And I think 24 stories, I think, is the count on that. So it's a good chunk of stories compared to the later ones, the people that would come later in the 1980s. But in the midst of all that, there's always the odd one or two, which I think that as fans we watch over and over again, whilst just because it's easy or because they're old friends and we know them scene by scene and it's just cozy. But there are others that I think, I wouldn't say they're unloved, but just sort of fall between the cracks. And this one is definitely the case when it comes to me. So I'm going to pop over to my mate Stephen here, who's going to remind me what the plot of Death of the Daleks is all about, what was going on in there.
A power failure in the TARDIS draws it off course, and the Doctor and Sarah Jane Smith end up stranded on the bleak planet of Exelon. They soon meet members of an Earth expedition in a similar situation. The humans are searching for a rare mineral, but first they must find out what is draining their power and avoid what's inside another grounded spaceship, the Doctor's oldest enemies, the Daleks.
Oh, I've got a shiver there, Stephen. Have you done this before by any chance? So this is Death of the Daleks, the classic Doctor Who story from all the way back there in 1974. It was broadcast between February and March of 1974, and of course it was written by who else but Terry Nation and directed by Michael E. Bryant. Now, Terry had what would you say his relationship was with Doctor Who at this point, Simon? Because he'd been away from it, hadn't he? Yeah, I would say come back with his tail between his legs, but he'd come back and he was writing Dalek stories again. And
yeah, because of course the background to what had happened. I mean, this was Terry Nation's 7th Doctor Who script and his 6th Dalek script. Because of course he'd written the Keys of Marinus as well in the 60s. But the reason Death to the Daleks comes along, written by Terry Nation, is because Barry Letts and Terrence Dix, by their own admission, made a terrible faux pas by allowing Louis Marks to write Day of the Daleks. And that had caused all manner of ruptions that Terry Nation's agent was not at all happy, because they should have come to Terry Nation to write the Dalek story, and it was just a mistake on the part of Letts and Dix. They just didn't think about it. And so anyway, apparently over a very, very champagne-fueled lunch, because Terry only drank the best champagne. I think he only drank champagne, truth be told, nothing else. And so over this champagne lunch, they agreed, okay, we're really sorry, Terry, should have brought you in. And so as a result, we guarantee we'll give you a Dalek story for you to write in every season from now on, which is why you end up with Planet of the Daleks, and then Death to the Daleks, and then Genesis of the Daleks. And so that's why Terry Nation is back. And as you say, Dan, he was a little bit tail between his legs, because of course he tried to sell the Daleks to America, and it had failed. And so here he was, back on familiar ground, writing the Daleks for Doctor Who. And also, let's not forget that just about all of the Terry Nation sort of tropes are in this story. This is a bit like.
Have you got a bingo card there? Have we got one?
You need one, don't you? Because it really is the greatest hits of Terry Nation. You got desert planets, deep space missions, handheld bombs, hunting down a precious mineral. You got monster infected places, power struggles within groups, self-sacrifice, a friendly alien who helps one of the companions. It's literally incredible that just about every Terry Nation thing, apart from the Jungle Planet.
You didn't even say you didn't say plague there. You managed to
plague. Plague.
Yeah.
There's so many, isn't there, Stephen? There's so many. You can't remember them all.
No.
And there's even
a character called Tarrant, Simon. Even a character called Tarrant.
You're quite right. Which is one of his. That was his favourite character name, of course. And so actually, the welcome addition to this, and I still think it's a brilliant conceit, is this idea of this huge energy drain that actually drains the energy of the Daleks as well. And I still think that was a pretty cool idea. Terry Nation, I think he was one of those people that he had all of these tropes that he brought to, but he always also brought one cracking new idea. And that's the cracking new idea in Death to the Daleks. And it delivers in spades, I think, personally.
Well, I suppose he would later look at that again with, well, this is something that I believe was kind of taken from Arena, the Star Trek episode, and he would again revisit it for Duel with Blake Seven. So I think you could be looking at similar riffs on the same thing. We've got a party of people rather than single people, but it's kind of the same.
But I think, as I said, this is what Terry Nation did best, and I think Death to the Daleks is very much it's sort of Doctor Who comfort food in a way, because it's got all of those familiar. It's not breaking any new ground. If you want to see it like it's treading water, you can do, but I don't see it like that. I see it very much as a celebration of what I personally love about Doctor Who. And I remember this story very, very vividly. I remember watching this one so clearly. This is one of the first Doctor Who stories. I do remember the story really clearly. Didn't understand at the time.
Where was Michael E. Bryant coming from with this? Because was he a bit of an old hand, a trusted hand in the stable of directors on the show at this point?
Well, he wasn't he, Stephen? I mean, as you mentioned, Sea Devils, but he'd also done Colony in Space.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, he's already directed, for my money, two of the strongest Pertwee stories.
The Green Death and the Sea Devils.
Sea Devils and the Green Death. And he broke his teeth on Colony in Space. I mean, he'd been working on the show right from the beginning. I think he was an assistant on the Daleks. I think
correct. Trainee assistant.
Was it his hand?
Yeah,
was it his hand in the gorilla glove, as it were, in
the Dalek Mutant?
In the Dalek Mutant, yeah.
And he was also he graduated up to being a production assistant on the Daleks Master Plan as well. So you're right, Stephen. He'd been right the way through. He'd worked.
He was working on Power of the Daleks. I mean, he the reason why the Daleks are painted silver after the Pertwee Daleks had we'd started to get used to the darker coloured Daleks. But he likes the black and white era Daleks, and so no, we're gonna paint them the original colours. And I think they're exactly the same livery as Power of the Daleks, I think.
That was also something that I struggled with when I first found the story. So this was a 4-part story, first broadcast during the early part of 1974, and the cast, it's got a good supporting cast. We've got John Abernethy's in there as Richard Railton. We've got Duncan Lamont playing Dan Galloway, Joy Harrison's Jill Tarrant, Julian Fox plays Peter Hamilton, Neil Seeler plays Commander Stewart. We have Michael Wisher provides the Dalek voices, very distinctive Dalek voices. Again, this is another thing that when I found the story, I struggled with that too. But most notably, we have the addition of Arnold Yarrow playing Belial. He tends to get all the attention when we look back at this story, doesn't he, Simon? Because he's a memorable character, like you say, who gets paired with the Doctor.
Yeah, and only recently, was it last year, we were celebrating his 100th birthday or something ridiculous.
He's 103 now.
102, that's right. He's now 103.
Yeah.
And he's still alive, God bless him. Absolutely. And of course, this is the second time we hear Michael Wisher's voices. First time we see, and the only time we see Arnold Yarrow as Belial. John Abernethy, of course, we'd seen previously. He'd been in The Feud from the Deep and the Ambassadors of Death. But you're right, Dan. It's Arnold Yarrow as Belial that really brings something. I still think he would have made a great companion. It's just a beautiful character to watch. He's a very likable character, and he's very accessible for the audience.
Because this is quite an adult story. I feel I felt it when I first saw it, and I felt it again now rewatching it. It's very, very adult. Some of the themes and some of the moments, I think the mood is very adult, and it's quite uncompromising. And then around halfway through, this character of Belial is introduced, Stephen, and he's almost childlike to the point. And even though, because the Doctor's separated from Sarah at that point. But you see him with he's got his arm round Belial, and he has a paternal sort of relationship with him. And so he is sort of a substitute companion. And I think it just works brilliantly. And him being an alien, obviously it's humanoid-ish, but him being alien as well, gives this, again, something that I don't think I'd seen the series do before.
Yeah, it's a remarkable performance by Arnold Yarrow, and it's another in the line of great masks by John Friedlander, of course, at the time, who'd done the Sea Devil masks and the Draconian mask and the Ogre, and was to go on to create his masterpiece the next year with Davros. So the mask is working very well and the costume and everything. But it's a lot, and he's probably the most successful of those Terry Nation character who looks like he's spooky to start with, but turns out to be an ally. So there's loads of them. There's Wester in Planet of the Daleks, Tyson in Destiny of the Daleks, Severin, obviously, yes. There's probably several others that
undoubtedly it's another Terry Nation.
But it works wonderfully. And there's a little personal story here, because I was incredibly fond of Bilal as a child, and my ex, when my son was very small, didn't want him to watch Doctor Who, and I eventually got her to let him watch some of the Pertwee stories. So for about 3 years, he thought Jon Pertwee was Doctor Who when around about the time Matt Smith was on the television, because his first one he ever saw was Spear from Space, and he'd seen the trailer for Death to the Daleks, and he'd completely latched on to Bel-Al in the trailer. It really sort of interested him, and he was around here, and his mother used to come and pick him up, and she'd often deliberately come a little bit earlier just to spoil everybody's fun, but that's another story. So we were getting towards the end of episode 2, and he was getting really excited because he knew that Bel-Al, because he'd seen the trailer and Bel-Al was coming up, and she arrived a little bit early. And we were just coming up to the cliffhanger, and he was going, "Can I stay and watch the end?" And she went, "No, we've got to go now." And you go, "Oh, please." And she went, "No, we've got to go now." And then he suddenly burst into, "But I want to see Bel-Al," he said. I thought, oh, this program's still working its magic, of course, in so many other ways. But and of course he didn't disappoint when he saw him next week. But it is one of the great sort of friendly alien performances, I think.
Yeah, but what I think is what I think is also good about his performance is that you mentioned Davros's mask the following year. Now the difference there is that you can see so much of Michael Wisher through Davros's mask, whereas Bel-Al's mask, you can see none of Arnold Yarrow whatsoever. Yeah. So he's got a much harder job. Than Michael Wisher, and he brings it to life. He still managed to bring it to life. Yeah. And of course, with the one thing that Michael Bryant wanted to do with Bel-Al's costume was do the front axial projection on it, to make it glow, to make the costume glow. And the front axial projection material was painted in sort of strands, so that you would have sort of had the idea that there would have been glowing sort of veins, as it were, going down Bel-Al, but it just got drowned. I think there's about one shot where it just about manages to work, and you just about get an idea that there is a sort of a slight glow to the costume, but it just got drowned out by the studio light.
It is very, very effective, and so are his eyes as well. They've got this sort of opaque look to them, as if he can see. We can't see his soul, but he can see ours. And obviously, I think Yarrow, he interprets the character in a very physical way as well, which sort of makes up for that somehow. As if he's doing it instinctually. How long they would have worked with one another in the rehearsal room, I don't know, to get to that, but it's delightfully balanced.
I think
No, you go, Stephen.
Well, I was going to say that I think that there's a case in point here of how those rehearsals worked in terms of actors being able to develop quite sort of close, intense relationships through the rehearsals. So you've got a situation there where clearly Arnold Yarrow in this case has developed with Sladen and with Pertwee very, very detailed and specific interactions. So first of all, I always want to give a shout out to Elizabeth Sladen, who was always sort of impeccable and delivering. Was a lovely phrase of Philip Hinchcliffe's. She could do the perils of Pauline 500,000 different ways.
and always with complete conviction. And her
Yes.
first encounter with Belial, her horror of what he looks like, but also her English politeness. She's playing that at the same time as also gradually becoming aware of the fact that he seems actually quite nice. And it's so sort of layered, that, and multi sort of nuanced. And that I think that sort of the sophistication of that interaction, and later the sophistication of the interaction that he has with Pertwee.
Well, she looks like she's afraid, but that she's pushing through anyway. Of actually, no, you've said that. I think, yeah, I see what you mean about. I took it that she was pushing through because she believed that that's what the Doctor would want her to do. That she had that she knew that the Doctor believed in her, and so she should believe in herself. But now you've mentioned it, I think some of the etiquette, the Britishness of that is there too. I must not let this alien be offended by the fact.
I think that's there because she's that sort of sophisticated, so she gets all these different layers. And of course, bear in mind, this is aside from the horror of Lynx, the first alien she's met. She's the first time she's been off planet as well. So she's playing all that. I think the alienation of being on an alien planet for the first time.
And because Arnold Jarrow then gives such a nuanced performance throughout the story, it repays the conviction that Sladen brings to her performance as Sarah is repaid because of the way Arnold Jarrow plays it. The other reason I fell in love with Belial, of course, is because he appeared in the Weetabix stand-up cards in those
the second lot of Weetabix cards, the one with the game,
correct.
From
1976.
Yes, it's 70. I think because it had Hieronymus.
Correct.
So it must. I think it must be 77.
76 going 77. Yeah, it's around that time.
The first lot, which went out in season 12.
Yeah.
They had only the giant robot was the only character from the Tom Baker era. They were all previous.
They were all Pertwees.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I was listening to your.
I was just going to say, what's interesting about that second tranche of Weetabix cards is Belial is at that point a very old character from 2 or 3 years previously, and a very, very minor character at that. So the fact that they saw fit to include him is a credit to the character. That shows the integrity of the character, I would say.
Yeah,
made a mark and probably stayed in children's memories.
They did also have a character that I couldn't remember, which was Vegan Exos.
Oh, nobody could remember Vegan Exos.
Does he die in about the first 2 minutes of
nobody could remember him. Why did they?
I remember going, who the hell's Vegan Exos?
So listening to your stories there about watching this back in the day and your memories brings to mind my first experiences with this, which was on VHS. Back in the late 80s, I had this on VHS, and I think it was actually the second tape that I ever had. So the first one I had was Spearhead from Space, and then I got this, and it seemed so drastically different to me from that very first Pertwee story, and the Daleks were so different. I mean, for me, a child of the 80s, a Dalek story meant that the Daleks were very formidable, ruthless, and their innards were tentacle creatures who would burst into flames and writhe with goo and things like that. Whereas in this story, they fall over and this doesn't seem to be anything inside them. So there was all these things when I first saw this story. But obviously when it's one of only 2 that one has on videotape, you watch it over and over again until something comes along, something else may get released that I liked better, was how I always looked at this story. I didn't not enjoy it. But to me, it was again, it was Doctor Who, but not Doctor Who as I thought it should look. And the character wasn't, as I said earlier on, wasn't the kind of character that I recognised. So I did really struggle with this story and with the Daleks. I thought, was it all really this cheap? It looked really cheap to me when I first saw it on VHS. Now I've got a rather different take on it, which I'll come to later. But obviously, starting in the TARDIS. Right the way back at the top of the story, the Doctor is traveling through time and space in the TARDIS again after several years, sort of largely being stuck on Earth. They kept that going for as long as they could, couldn't they? But here, as you say, they've got Terry Nation back on board. He thrusts them into quite a familiar story. But I suppose, because I suppose the kids who were watching this hadn't been served it in a while, they probably couldn't remember the last time Terry Nation had offered this. I suppose it doesn't really matter. But what really struck me about all of it, right from the very start, was how atmospheric it was, and how cozy it was, because obviously the sets are all quite small. Yeah. And even though the locations are quite expansive, all the sets are quite small. And a lot of the reactions, Stephen, are very much on people's faces. Why wouldn't you focus on a face as exquisite as Elizabeth Sladen's, or as expressive as Jon Pertwee's? But it's with all the characters too. It feels like quite a personal story. I think that's because of the stakes as well, because they're detached from a broader canvas of a situation, aren't they? A kind of an intergalactic conflict. But Nation goes to great lengths. I think Robert Holmes was script editor on this, wasn't he? I think he was uncredited.
It's the first one. Yes, the first
yeah.
one he worked on.
I think between them, they go to great lengths to make sure that they focus on the human interest angle. And I think when I was a child first seeing this at like 10, 12 years old, that largely passed me by. Now, as an adult, I thought it was very, very rich and it grabbed me right away, Simon.
The location footage in particular is very, very well done. I think it's very, very atmospheric. That opening sequence of one of the members of the military team being shot, it's really quite
brutal.
It's very graphic. And again, that becomes a Michael Bryant thing, because then of course he does exactly the same thing at the beginning of Genesis of the Daleks as well. So he knows how to start with an impact. But the location footage, I just think is brilliant. The way they marry it up with the studio. You're right, the sets are very small. They do marry it up with the studio footage well. I just remember it's the location footage as much as anything that I have distinct memories of. In particular, this is the first time we ever see down a Dalek eye stalk, as it were. This remarkable
that was
idea.
Thrilling. That was thrilling at the time. Yes.
Absolutely.
The Dalek POV was
correct.
One of the. There are a number of. It's interesting, Dan, saying about the not being impressed with it in 1987. There were certain stories that when I saw them again for the first time, and of course we didn't get to see them for a long time. So if you saw a story in like this one, 1973, I didn't see this until it came out. I think it was July 1987. Yeah. I didn't see the Ark in Space from 1975 until 1985 at a Merseyside local group meeting. And there was when I saw the Sea Devils for the first time, it was almost shot for shot as I'd remembered it. Mm-hmm. There were some stories that were a bit of a shock. And I have to admit, this was one of them. Because my memories, of course, all seen in black and white. And as quite a young child, so if I'm still 5, going on 6 when this is on. And so your memories are dim and impressionistic, and a child's memories, and in black and white. My memories of Death Daleks are the first episode, which I think is the one that stands up the best
I agree.
Scrutiny. In fact, Peter Capaldi said it's the first part of it before the sun comes up is almost perfect in its atmospheric creation of the weirdness of that planet and what Carey Blyton's doing effectively at that point. Less so later on with the Daleks, but we'll come to that. But so when the VHS came out, all my memories were with it being really dark and mysterious and hammer horror, or like horrific and scary and strange. The surprise, the shock, the astonishment, the mild disgust of it not being like that, and hearing Carey Blyton's, as somebody said, it might have been.
I don't feel quite so bad now, Stephen, because I thought these guys are going to hate me slating this story.
No. I know why people disparage this story, and I can see it because I saw it from that perspective when I first saw it again. And as somebody, I think it might have been Rob Shearman who said, the music that Carey Blyton wrote for the Daleks is like accompanying the Devil's Horde with the music from the Flumps, which is a 1970s lunchtime kids.
I remember the Flumps. Yeah.
You remember?
Yeah.
You know, it's an astonishing choice to put that music together with the Daleks. There are times when the music is wonderfully evocative and works very well. I think the music with the city, when Sarah sees the city, a lot of the eeriness in the first episode is odd, and Michael Bryant again is chosen, although Kerry Blunt had been used by Timothy Combe for the Silurians. But again, he's gone for something off the beaten track to do something different.
I get the impression that Michael E. Bryant is looking for ways to make it more interesting for him as well. Even the scenes, here we're at a clay pit. Doctor Who had been to loads already, and it would continue to keep going back to clay pits until 1989, until the classic show wrapped up. But here, he augments it, I feel, with those hand shots that you're talking about, Stephen, with lots and lots of mist. And I think the Exelons
that come out of the sand. I don't know how they manage that, but it actually looks like it's coming out of the ground. It's really,
to the best of my knowledge, the show had never done that before. It had never treated the location almost as a prop in itself, as a mobile studio. And those Exelons, I was watching them. There were certain scenes where he'd lit it in such a way where the Exelons, with their sort of capes, their crusty old capes, would almost appear. They'd sort of appear out of, they'd break the sand as if they were literally coming out of the landscape and start to move around. So there was points watching the DVD version, where it's all been sort of cleaned up a little, where I couldn't spot where the Exelons were hiding. It was very, very effective. And I did wonder, might George Lucas have seen this when he was creating Star Wars, looking at the Sand People?
Because they certainly are like a precursor to the Sand People. There's no two ways about it. And
I haven't seen it before.
I think the thing, and that that sequence that we're looking at there now, I can remember so vividly that on the one hand, this is the story where suddenly Daleks become a little bit too vulnerable. They are too easy to push over, and you see that there's nothing inside them. They're too easy to literally, all you need is get a bunch of Exelons with some wooden sticks, beat the Dalek over the head, and it'll eventually just blow up. It's not showing Daleks how we're used to seeing Daleks. And of course, this is also, Death to the Daleks is the first time we start to sort of get suicidal Daleks, where they just blow themselves up out of sheer desperation from having mucked up the job that they were given to do.
Do you think that was Terry Nation? Because it does seem at odds with his own view of the characters, or could that have been Robert Holmes pressing a sort of advantage that he would have had?
Well, Nick Briggs' theory there is that Dalek that has a nervous breakdown is was supposed to blow up, but they didn't have the budget to blow it up, so it just mysteriously commits a strange kind of sort of reticent suicide, doesn't it? Which is
possibly. I mean, he literally that if we're talking about the right Dalek, that Dalek only commits suicide simply because it happens to have lost Jill Tarrant. It hasn't really done anything too disastrous. It just happens to have lost its prisoner, so it decides to self-destruct.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Well, maybe there's a degree of desperation on Terry Nation's part that, again, he's just trying to do something different with the Daleks. They don't. The tragedies, they don't come across desperately menacing in the way that actually I thought they did do in Planet of the Daleks. They came across pretty scary.
Yeah, they do. And I think also with Planet of the Daleks, there's something about the ring modulation there with both Skelton and Wisher, which is very, very abrasive. And I think they're very close to the microphones. I think the Daleks have never sounded more aggressive and sort of alarming than they do in Planet of the Daleks.
Whereas they do seem lesser creatures somehow here, don't they? And you also wonder whether maybe, getting really sort of psychoanalytical for a second, you wonder whether just taking away the firepower of the Daleks, although I think it's a brilliant conceit, maybe it did just sort of emasculate the Daleks, and suddenly they just were not as threatening as they were previously. And yet I personally adore the machine pistols that they fit themselves with.
Absolutely. I think this is Pertwee's The Chase, this story, in many ways.
I think that's fair.
It's the sort of the Dalek light story. If you take it on its own terms, it's also got some very sort of mysterious and quite deeply disturbingly effective stuff early on. But if you just take its lightness on its own terms, I think it's terrifically enjoyable.
And I
It's a runaround, isn't it, Stephen? It's a runaround.
Yes, it
But
is.
because
It is.
even though it is a runaround, as people sort of go from place to place and get captured and fall down things and climb up things, all that's going on, and you've got we've got two alien races, the Daleks, and an indigenous population, which again we've seen before. It's that which is going on between the humans, which I think is the most interesting, because you would think, and again, I don't know who this came from, whether it was Nation or Holmes or a little bit of both, but the human characters in this, they are shown as mostly quite layered and quite sophisticated for a family show. There's a darkness underneath. I mean, one character in particular, but actually most of them seem to have, they just seem very, very human. There's not, oh, he's the nice one. Yeah, he may be nice, but he's also a little bit pathetic, and you want to give him a dry slap because he's letting the side down. And you've got one who seems to be completely ruthless, only out for himself. They develop him too. John Aberneri is perhaps very anchored as the leader of the little group, who meets a very fast end, doesn't he? I've forgotten so many of the details. I hadn't seen this story. I've been working it out for over 20 years. Yeah. I'd given it that much of a wide berth. I'd never even opened the cellophane on my DVD. The last time I saw this was on VHS. Wow. It would have been the edited one that came out in the mid-90s, the unedited one that came out in the mid-90s, but it was on VHS. So I'd pushed it that far away. And so this is why I've been so surprised that I found so much in it as an adult. This scene where he's given explicit orders, isn't he? That character. His name's Dan, isn't it?
Yeah.
Dan. Yes, your namesake, Dan Galloway.
The character's name is Dan Galloway.
Yes.
Yeah. So I should remember that, shouldn't I? So Dan Galloway, he goes against the final wishes of his commanding officer, doesn't he? And he keeps it to himself because he's only told him. God, what a piece of work.
He's a nasty character. What I think is really interesting about this story is again, this in particular reminds me so much of the Dalek annuals from the mid-late 70s as well. The Marine Space Corps in Death to the Daleks basically are the anti-Dalek force, the ADF, from the annuals, or they're also very reminiscent of the Space Security Service. There we go. Those annuals.
Which, of course, that was the first time I saw the photograph of that.
There you go. There you go. That's the picture of the blazing Dalek. And as I say, that this story could have been out of one of those Dalek annuals. Joel Shaw, who's the main guy of the anti-Dalek force in the ADF in the Dalek annuals, could well have been John Aberneri's character Richard Relton in this story. And so it's very, very Terra Nation from that point of view. And yet the other part of it that I love about it is that they look like they've stepped out of a 50s sci-fi movie, something like This Planet Earth. Do you know what I mean?
Turtlenecks.
Yeah.
Isn't the insignia the same as the Blake 7 Federation insignia on the?
I had to look twice at it when I rewatched it. Yeah.
It's certainly very similar.
It goes in and out.
I think of the characters, the best character there is and the best played is, of course, your namesake Dan Galloway, and from that 80s VHS version, there are certain lines of his that just became Doctor Who lines that I would never forget, and the particular way he delivers them, like. He's frightened of the wee salt shakers is one of them, and that line there. What is it? I'm sorry, Commander. I couldn't quite hear what you said.
Yeah, that's the line of the story for me.
And oh man, where have you been hiding? That's another one. And he's Scottish. He has to say "oh," doesn't he? But
it was almost like watching this again for the first time with me. I actually thought that Galloway was gonna bump him off. I thought, well, if he doesn't expire of his own a natural death, he's gonna send him off
with his knife. But I think it's nice that he's redeemed, isn't he? Because he may be a glory hunter, but he's obviously.
Yeah.
Actually, you often think with it's characters like that, isn't it, that actually get things done. and we need people who are that ruthless.
They move the story along.
Yeah, absolutely. So you know, I think it's I think he's well written and well played. I'm not sure about Peter and Jill.
Jill comes off the worst, undoubtedly. I think she's, bless her, she's a very weak character.
And she'll be sort of putting facial expressions on her face, which you know, is, I know I need to be reacting somehow, but I'm not quite sure what the facial expression is for this emotion, this moment. And they come across, they remind me of sort of characters from a 70s sitcom or something, or they could be guests at Fawlty Towers, couldn't they?
Abigail's party. It looks like she's about to bring out a quiche.
That's exactly how it feels. Like they stepped out of a 70s sitcom at a dinner party.
When he says, my father died in the last Dalek war, so he could almost be complaining about the sort of the filthy room in Fawlty Towers, you know.
Yeah.
My wife Jill's terribly upset. The bath was filthy and she found moths in the mattress. You know.
I always kind of think they're not really like the Marines that we had in Aliens, for example, are they?
No,
they are more dinner party guests than the Marines, than true Marines.
Galloway's the only one I believe. Well, Abineri's, you know, always solid, isn't he?
He's great.
I hate to disagree, but I did believe in most of them. I know what you're saying about Jill. There was something. She was perhaps a little too plummy. And looking back, but she was also there for the Doctor to put his arm around her a few times as well.
It's of its time. That character is of its time.
Yeah. And I hadn't looked at Galloway in that way either. I suppose him being an egomaniac and him thinking that he was the one who had all the answers. Only he saw it this way. Only he saw it the right way. Only he was placed to sort of save the day at the end. So I don't know if that is a redemption, because it's sort of the natural endpoint, I suppose, of somebody being that full of themselves and a ruthlessness. But I suppose it also shows that that there's good and bad in everybody, and that it's maybe not black and white. We don't see characters on television so much now, I feel.
Well, also, I think the thing is, it again just showed, that character again just sort of shows Terry Nation for what he was very good at doing, which was just telling rattling good yarns, and knowing, as Stephen has said, which character is going to move the story on. It's one of those things, you know, we've laughed about all the sort of Terry Nation-isms that are within this story, and yet very little of the story is actually wasted. If you think how much happens in this story, in the different locations we move through, the different scenarios.
There is a lot,
There's a lot going on in this story, and none of it's wasted. There's no subplots that meander aimlessly and go nowhere.
Terry Nation was nothing if not economical. And as I was watching this again, I'd remembered, there's things I'd remembered about it. I couldn't remember the fates of any of the characters. I remembered Bilal and little things. But I thought, well, I know that they get to that sort of, there's a living city in this, but it came into the story a lot later than I'd remembered. And it does, as you said, Simon, it moves the location exactly the right amount at the right time. And I feel that it does that all the way through the story. Those immensely unsettling scenes where the Doctor has tracked the Exelons to their lair, hasn't he? And Sarah's going to be sacrificed, and they're chanting, and it's all like Steadicam. So we're right up in these aliens' faces, and you've got no doubt at all that they are going to sacrifice Sarah. Time's up, and the Doctor, nobody's going to help him either, and it feels very, very claustrophobic, and it stays there just for the right period of time as well. And how they get out of it is perhaps, looking back, a little hokey, but I didn't feel like that at the time watching it. It had seduced me, I think, Stephen. The combination of music, sets, the performances, everything just seduced me. I've had a total turnaround about this story.
I think there are things that are very strong about it, and there are things that are weaker about it. But I think it's very solidly plotted. And some of I think the music, talking about the sacrifice scene, the music of the high priest and all that stuff is wonderfully eerie and strange and chilling and surreal, and the sacrifice scene is quite sort of sordid, isn't it? When she's being sort of narcotized with whatever is in that in that goblet.
It feels like she's being violated. And
It does.
Sarah.
It does feel. It feels quite sort of.
You want to reach into the screen and pull her away.
Yeah. And a lot of there's a lot of inventive work from always with Michael Bryant, but a lot of inventive camera work. You know, the POV stuff of the Daleks, the POV stuff. Because I think it's the first time we get a POV from the
absolutely.
Daleks,
yeah, it is.
and the POV of the Exelon. I mean that and it's talking about the brutality of it. I mean, Sarah beats the thing to death in the TARDIS, doesn't she?
Yeah. And it's still left in the TARDIS. Let's not forget it's still.
He's still there. He's still there somewhere.
It gets taken out.
No.
Dead Exelon from the TARDIS.
Yeah. But that POV stuff in the when Pertwee rushes in to save it, that's all very sort of the hands over the lens and everything. So within the sort of the parameters of the studio setup and the limitations, Michael Bryant's doing a lot of interesting stuff.
Yes.
Occasionally, Carey Blyton is coming up with extraordinary stuff. Occasionally, it's not so effective. The Dalek theme, etc. It's a very, very sort of mixed experience I have with it, because I still do think that first episode is incredibly strong, and yes, it must be very jarring for fans who are used to seeing the Daleks presented as a very powerful threat. But it's nowhere near as offensive in that area as, say, Destiny of the Daleks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, also there is a certain sort of pleasure and glee to be had from watching various Daleks come to various sticky ends. You know,
absolutely.
That is quite satisfying to see. I mean, the one that still stands out to me in particular is, and I remember this vividly as a child, is the Dalek up on the side of the hillside with the root coming up out of the water. I mean, it's a brilliant sequence. Brilliant. The root coming up out of the lake, zapping the Dalek, and the Dalek falling down into the lake. I mean, that reminds me very much. In fact, the whole story, again, you know, I've just sort of said it reminds me a lot of the Dalek annuals. It also reminds me very, very much of the TV Century 21 Dalek comic strips. You know, you take the Doctor out and Sarah out of this story, and this could absolutely have been one of the TV Century 21 comic strips in there. And that set piece in particular of the Dalek being zapped and falling down into the lake from having been zapped by the root, that would have been a double-page full-color spread in TV Century 21. It's got that. It has that comic book feel to it. Yes. And a visual feel, and again the sequence with the roots coming down through the corridor after the
roots themselves, Simon, they're so visually memorable as well.
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of visually memorable stuff in there, and that's what hooked into me as a kid. Again, I remember vividly that root scuttling down the corridor, and as I say, rearing up in front of the.
Now they do that, wouldn't they? With CGI, obviously, it looks very, very sophisticated. But I actually think there's an eeriness to the way that the roots kind of dangle and gradually shift, as if they are tentacles of something that is alive. And in some ways, the city feels like a character in this story in those latter episodes.
Which is how, of course, it's meant to feel. And this is where, as I say, that I just feel the story rattles along, because what you don't expect, when the beginning of episode 1, you don't expect by the end, by episode 4, we're going to be watching this weird, sort of almost psychedelic journey through this living city with all these really weird characters that come along. It's a bit of a trip. Episode 4 is a bit of a trip, I think. It's
one of those you can take out and show people, separate it from the rest. Say, okay, this was what Doctor Who was like then, and it would probably be a fairly accurate representation of not just what Doctor Who was like then, but what adventure television was like then, and what television of that age. And
I have to say, this wouldn't be one I'd show somebody who'd never seen Doctor Who before. That's absolutely. I think it would always be I think it would always be Genesis of the Daleks. But it's interesting. I mean, you singling out the scene with the root coming out of the water. That was one of. It was so vivid that it became sort of multiplied and misremembered in my mind. What people have to remember, of course, is that when these things went out, not only did we not stand much chance of seeing them again, and we'd probably seen them in black and white, but there were very few photographs from them either available. So there's a photograph of that one of the Doctor and Belle was in the Doctor Who Monster book at the end of 1975. There's the picture of the Dalek on fire. And then in Doctor Who Daleks Monster book, Doctor Who and the Daleks Omnibus, 1976, there was a picture of Pertwee surrounded by the Daleks. They were the only photographs that I saw for years. The book didn't come out till 1978. So all your memories of a story would subside into mystery and myth. And so, until eventually you got to see the stories again. So the scene with the root, I'd remembered, and I used to draw it as though there were loads of roots coming out of the
course you did,
and attacking loads of Daleks.
Yeah,
I think I was drawing the very next day, loads of roots coming up out of the water, and I'd created this memory that there were sort of loads of these snakes, as I thought they were, attacking loads of Daleks, and that became so. When I first saw the story, I was surprised there was only one root and only one Dalek. Because the memory had sort of
this is fascinating to me, because a few years later after this, I watched Destiny of the Daleks, which I know that people who are slightly older have a very dim view of, and did exactly the same thing. For me, the battle with the Mavellans and the Daleks, to me, that was like The Empire Strikes Back or something. It set my imagination alight. So I'm now looking at this story in a slightly different way too, and understanding why people have latched onto it, and probably why it was such an early VHS release as well.
Yeah, I think the thing is, I mean, the picture that's on screen at the moment of the exploding Dalek, I think there are just so many visually arresting images within the story that you can see why, as a kid, as I say, you would be excited by seeing a Dalek exploding. It doesn't matter that the Dalek explodes just purely because they hit it with a wooden stick. And the roots, and then, as I say, once we get into the city and that red and white checkered floor, which is literally seared into my memory, that red and white checkered floor, seared into my memory. And it's one of the weakest cliffhangers in the entire history of Doctor Who, that they just walk up to this floor and look at it, and we get a cliffhanger. And of course, that's because they had to juggle the editing. That wasn't supposed to be the cliffhanger, which is why it doesn't quite work. But as a kid, that red and white board.
But it's one of the most. It is one of the most powerfully memorable cliffhangers of my childhood.
Spot on.
It's so frequently ridiculed. But watching it in black and white, because in my memory, it looked like an aerial shot of an enormous black and white chessboard, bear in mind the Daleks are coming up behind them, and bear in mind that when Jon Pertwee says "stop, don't move," you know that there's something to be frightened of. So
I guess so.
The other phrase for cliffhanger is suspended enigma. There was an enigma about that. What is that thing? He knows there's something to be afraid of, and so that creates in your mind a sense that it's threatening.
I think the thing is,
a very conscious decision, Simon, of Pertwee's probably working with Michael E. Bryan. So, okay, we'll kind of put this onto you. You sell this.
Yes, in many ways it is. And so I think, as I say, because it was never meant to be the cliffhanger, it was kind of an awkward one to sort of kind of shoehorn in and try to make it work in the edit. And now, with modern sensibilities and adult eyes, we can look at it and say, well, actually, it doesn't quite cut the mustard as a cliffhanger. But, Stephen, you're spot on. None of that matters as a kid. What matters, and I just think I don't know what it is about that red and white board, but there was something. I saw it in color. I was looking at see it in color, and there was something about it, the design itself.
I think it's an interesting design. I like the shapes of because it's not just squares, is it? There's something about it which is
correct.
Strange.
Correct. And somehow it's just a remarkable thing that one very, very simple design absolutely blew my mind as a how old was I? 6-year-old at this point. Because it's in many ways it's just so weird and so unusual, and so likewise, because it had seared itself into my mind so much, when the same scene comes along in the Five Doctors and they have that black and white chessboard, immediately I knew, I guessed that what they were trying to do was to, and I don't know whether they were or not, it doesn't matter in my mind, they were trying to link it with this red and white checkerboard.
I think it's Terence desperately trying to find another threat in the Tower of Russell. Oh, I remember that. There's a bit of the Death to the Daleks. I'm going to put that in there.
But isn't it interesting that it doesn't work anywhere near as well as Death to the Daleks? It's the design.
Yeah, it's the design. It's also that Venusian hopscotch makes more sense than pie.
Yeah.
What the hell, pie?
Yeah. Never made
as easy as pie. As easy as pie. No, he didn't. The Greek letter pie. Well, that's probably the biggest bollocks moment in the whole history. But fond as I am of the Five Doctors, in all respect, and to the great Terence Dicks, but that's hilariously lame, isn't it? It's
very lame.
If there is a universally indelible image that comes from Death to the Daleks, it is that of a Dalek in flames, isn't it? The photos are so evocative, and it could possibly be the reason why the book cover, the Target book cover, was recently voted. In fact, I think it's been voted several times the best Doctor Who book cover still of all time. This was by the artist Roy Knipe, wasn't it, Simon? And it came out in 1978. This was probably one of the first paperbacks I ever bought. Partly, judge a book by its cover. I tended to. Sometimes I still do. It immediately grabbed me. It was very, very arresting. But also the title, Death to the Daleks, as well. Even the title it's just 4 words, and it's just a flip. The middle 2 words, to and the, have just been rearranged. The Death of the Daleks. It's a very typical Doctor Who title, but just slightly repointed enough to sound really, really cool. It sounds like a Tarantino Doctor Who movie.
Well, we're so used to of-thers, aren't they? The to there is quite sort of arresting, isn't it? And there's my copy from 1978. So that's still there.
Oh, let's have a look.
But so there we are, and still in very good nick. So obsessed was I with the iconic image of the burning Dalek that and I really was, because I think we all were. I had it was a couple of talking Daleks, which was, I don't know what year they came out. Was it be 77? I think it was 77.
78.
77, 78. And I had a couple of them, and I got permission from my father
to blow one up.
To do. I've got it here. With his lighter to create this, which is
wow.
That's my homage to the photograph, because I kept the head on it. But it was gradually sort of melted into that shell. I'll put it on here. There you can see.
That's really quite incredible.
And it's actually sort of little work of art, really, isn't it?
It certainly is a work of art.
And it's travelled with me wherever I go.
Wow! Thank goodness you still got
it has
that.
to be carefully packed because it's very fragile.
Yeah.
And the eye stalk has a tendency to break off.
God, that's incredible, though.
But no, it is one of, I think it's one of the most enduring and potent images of the classic series, the Burning Dalek, and of course it's a great joy to watch revived series episodes where they have the budget to do it properly.
Well, but this is where you see I would favour the Death to the Daleks approach, because
me too.
That Dalek, once it's been destroyed by the Exelons, it's very. It's almost got kind of a Vietnam War kind of feel. It's done in a documentary style.
Like it.
It's bleak. The way it's
Yeah.
done, it's very bleak. It's very, as I say, it's documentary style in the way it's done with handheld cameras. And it feels, as I say, like something out of the Vietnam War, a tank just left.
I looked at that
by
way.
the side of the road.
I'd seen it as being I'd seen it as being a totem of sorts, and they were almost dancing around it. Like this is almost ritualistic.
Almost paganistic.
I think I like yours better.
I like both. I like both those perspectives on it. That's brilliant. It's a ritualistic token, but it is redolent of an image from late 60s, early 70s news.
That's right.
News reports.
Or Northern Ireland, for example, where
Ireland.
we used to seeing those tanks getting burnt out on the side of the road. It's just got that feel to it, very visceral. Whereas now, absolutely, they do it in overblown CGI, and it would. Well, we've seen Daleks blowing up in overblown CGI. I don't know how many times, and I can't remember any of them or any of the stories that they're in.
No.
Whereas this is burned into your memory. And that says it all to me.
I think I entirely agree with you. I think it's effective because it's so simple, you know, and also they're actually burning a real thing, which is good.
Yes,
CGI always looks
CGI
like sophisticated cartoons, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Really, you know,
I suppose it does.
It's artificial.
As the years go on as well, I think that's increasingly so. Whereas you see something like this, it's unsettling because you know it's real, and if you believe in the story, if you care about the characters, and the stakes seem reasonable and measurable in that moment when you're sat on the sofa, then if it's something that you feel you can reach out and touch, whether it looks cheap or not, it's kind of by the by now. I think that's why a lot of classic Doctor Who has now sort of come out from under the cloud of the idea that it looks so dated. I think that vintage television does that after long enough. Now I think when people talk about dated television, they talk about things that were made in the early noughties, whereas things like this kind of get a hall pass because they are of their own world, and everything about the place that they exist in, the costumes, the way it's shot, the clay pits, everything is so idiosyncratic to a time. Pointing out that it is dated is just maybe it's neither here nor there.
Maybe, Dan, it's that it eventually sort of comes full circle. Maybe it becomes maybe a few years ago it looked dated. Now it looks that we're able to see it within context of when it was made, and so it no longer looks dated. It just looks, as you say, reminiscent of the time in which it was made. I have this sort of theory, that dated, when things look dated, it's because they were made just a few years ago. And the technology or the stylistic approach has moved on. Whereas something like this, which is how many years, 50 years old now.
Well, like a capsule of something.
Correct. It now has an integrity of its own. It surpasses being dated. It stops being dated because it's so long in the past that actually it exists in its own little world, its own world of the past. So it's no longer dated. I've always thought that. And I think Doctor Who is the perfect example of that. There's not a lot, I don't think, in Doctor Who that I feel that in the classic run looks dated. It looks of its time, but there's a difference, isn't there, between being dated and just and still being able to hold up. You know, as long as something still works and can hold on to its own and holds up to scrutiny, it doesn't matter. Whereas dated kind of suggests something that's poor, that's of poor quality.
Yeah.
And it's not that. Doctor Who, classic Doctor Who, is not that. It's just that it's of its time, and I think there's the crucial difference.
This is I'm fascinated by your observations, gentlemen, about this 4-part Doctor Who story from all the way back in 1974. And as ever, I have to remind that we know, all of us know only too well, this is hardly the first word on any of these classic or new Doctor Who stories, and neither are they the last word either. They're just the latest word of slices of Doctor Who's long history on television. That's been a near constant companion, barring like 16 bloody years, to so many of us for so long. And these are our personal connections, very, very personal connections, memories, artifacts, if you're Stephen Noonan, and readings of it. I think that's another beauty of this show in particular, that we can all see all these different things, different strands of culture and of history, of real world history. Because as I'm fond of saying, it's one of those stock phrases that I say, the Doctor Who doesn't exist in a bubble, does it? There's more where that came from too, but it's time for a break now. It's time for us to parade the other podcasts that you'll find across the Fandom Podcast Network with us here to you now. Kevin's going to fill you in on all of that. Then you can meet Stephen, Simon, and myself back here for more as we traverse the city of the Exelons and give you our rating for Death to the Daleks. I need to wait for that.
Thank you for listening. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. Here are the other great shows on the Fandom Podcast Network. Culture Clash, where we discuss the latest in entertainment and pop culture. Blood of Kings, our show covering the entire Highlander universe. Couch Potato Theater, we celebrate our favorite movies. And Time Warp, our fandom flashback show discussing a year in movies and our favorite retro movie, TV, and pop culture topics. Good Evening, discussing all things Alfred Hitchcock. Hair Metal Podcast, we cover the rock metal music of the 80s and early 90s. Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast, discussing the time-traveling Doctor Who universe. Lethal Mullet, an action film podcast covering the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Also, check out the Lethal Mullet Network for more great podcasts. What a Piece of Junk, our Star Wars podcast. Making Treks, a Star Trek podcast with a deep dive into the final frontier. The Fandom Show, our Fandom Podcast Network live YouTube show discussing the hottest topics in fandom. The True Believers MCU podcast discussing the Marvel Cinematic and Television Universe. Union Federation, our Star Trek and the Orville show. And we're proud to welcome the BQN Network to the Fandom Podcast Network. Please visit our friends on the BQN Network, a Star Trek Universe podcast that also includes your favorite topics, movies, history, superheroes, and more. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on YouTube. The Fandom Podcast Network is also on all major podcast platforms. The Fandom Podcast Network audio master feed is on Podbean at fpnet.podbean.com. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, respect others and enjoy your fandom.
Cheers for that one, Kev. He's teased and tantalized you there as always, and we can even clothe you too. There's merch to match all of the shows, including Type 40. If you head over to tpublic.com, search for the Fandom Podcast Network, and that's where you'll find the store full of all the team colours for all of the shows, on everything from t-shirts to phone cases and tapestries. Every time I say that, it sounds more outlandish and ridiculous, but no, tapestries. It's all over there at tpublic.com. Seeing is believing. Treat yourself, treat your other selves. It all goes to support the Fandom Podcast Network into the bargain too, so everybody wins. I'm back here with Simon Horton and Stephen Noonan on the planet of the Exelons, for Death to the Daleks. And yeah, we've had our big review of this, and we've unearthed all sorts of memories from our own sand dunes, the sand dunes in my mind, as I rediscovered this story after 20 years. I can barely believe it. Okay, so here's the hardest part of all, I think, particularly when a story is sort of tied to a key part, a fundamental part of your life, Stephen. How do you begin to give this a score out of 5? How many roots out of 5 would you give Death to the Daleks, Stephen?
Well,
I'll go to you first.
It can't be objective, can it? And it can,
doesn't
none
have
of these
to be on this show.
None of these things. And it was, I loved the last section of what Simon was saying about timelessness, the difference between something that's dated and something that's of its time. I suppose everything's going to be of its time, and it's going to be clearly made at a particular time. But whether that will mean anything to what's fascinating to me as I have had the wonderful opportunity to get involved in the Doctor Who world in the way that I have, is meeting fans who are people in their 20s, or there's a lad I've become very good mates with who's only 19, and the way this program breaks down those generations. So when you're having conversations with these people that are generations younger than you about stories like this, it's as though you're the same age. And what this, of course, a lot of them came through the conduit of the revived series, but then fell in love with the classic series, and then that broadens their knowledge of the culture around it. So they get to know about other series, other programs, and politics and society and culture of the world around 1974 in this case, or whatever it is. But it is astonishing how timeless this program has proved to be, and how its cultural significance and flexibility down the decades. 50 years ago it's made, and people are watching it as though it's as relevant and as powerful and as vivid as it was at the time. And perhaps
you're definitely talking our language there, Stephen.
Perhaps
this is very much the ethos of Type 40, what we do here.
Yeah. But I'm of course procrastinating giving the score. I can't give it any less. You're not allowed fractions or decimal points.
No, well, when we originally started doing this, I'd say to people, stick to a clean number if you can. But nobody listens. Nobody listens to me. So go for the.
I've already revealed that I have reservations about it, and it's not the story I remember from 1974 when I saw it in '85. But of course, you come out the other side of your teenage disappointment that it didn't have the production values that you thought it had, etc., etc. And I think on the level that it's what it sets out to do, it does very, very effectively, and it tries to be adventurous. It tries to be Michael Bryant's trying to do innovative things with it. So for all that, and for that, every time I watch it, I thoroughly enjoy it. And that it's one of my sons, who's now 14, favorite stories. So its timelessness is proven in that way. I can't give it any less than 4. There you go.
I think that's fair. How about you, Simon? How many roots out of 4 would you give?
It's out of 5, isn't it? Can you say?
Yes, I did. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll go for that again.
He's only allowed out of 4.
Take 2. Okay, so yes, we'll go for that. One again, everybody. Don't tell the Fandom Podcast Network. They think I'm good at this. So yes, Simon Horton, how many roots out of 5 would you give Death to the Daleks?
Look, the truth of it is, I think Death to the Daleks is, as we've said already, it has some really, really brilliant, startling, arresting imagery in it, and some startling, innovative, arresting ideas. The city that is alive that then melts so memorably at the end, even though you can see suddenly that it's when they do the close-ups on the polystyrene bits, you can see it's polystyrene.
Just squint or take your glasses off.
Doesn't matter. I just think it has some really, really remarkable ideas bursting out of it, and I think it's one of Terry Nation's more original and innovative scripts, for all of the fact that we've said it's just got every single Terry Nationism within it. As a true Doctor Who story, watching it, I'm sorry, it ain't no Robots of Death. It's not Pyramids of Mars. It's not the Demons. It's not Inferno. It's not any of those things. So being really brutally, cruelly honest.
This isn't like you, Simon. I'm surprised at this ruthless streak coming out.
Well, hold on, because there's a Doctor Who story. I would probably only give it 2 out of 5. I'm sorry. I probably would only give it 2 out of 5 when I'm comparing it with all the other stuff that it's compared with. But, and this is the big thing, I am going to give it 5 out of 5, and you will forgive me for that, because this story means so much to me, because I remember it so clearly, and I know that this was the point that I started to become obsessed with Doctor Who. I loved Doctor Who at this point, but Death to the Daleks, because there is so much in it that is memorable. So everything before Death to the Daleks, I can remember just the merest hints. Death to the Daleks literally burrowed into my brain in so many ways. And I know that I think this was the turning point for me, where it turned into an obsession. And so
Simon, how often? Oh, sorry, carry on. Sorry.
No, that's it. I'm done. It's a 5. Sorry, put your question down.
So your 4 marks, 5 5 routes out of 5 for that.
5 out of 5.
Well, my question would be actually to both of you, but first to Simon. So, how often do you go back and revisit this story? Is this one that you've seen quite a lot?
No, I actually haven't. If I think of something like The Robots of Death, which I've seen, I literally haven't I've lost count. Whereas Death to the Daleks, no, I would say I've watched this probably only 5 or 6 times. And part of that is because actually, for all that I've said, that I think there's some brilliant stuff in there, I actually don't think it's a very good Doctor Who story. But because it means so much to me, the more I watch it, the shakier it becomes. And I start to see the rough edges. And I don't want to see those rough edges. So I'm happy with it as a bit more of a
No, I can completely relate to that. There are movies and TV shows that I haven't gone back to purposely because I don't want them to be kind of revealed as to what they are. How about you, Stephen? I mean, how often do you go back to a story like this? When you watch classic Doctor Who, do you just, I'm in the mood for Death of the Daleks now, or I quite fancy Frontios, or do you go through season by season in a very sort of methodical way?
There's never Frontios. I'm interested in Simon's response. What was it like? How long was it before you saw it after it went out 74? And were you, like I was, rather shocked?
Yes.
By it not in no way, apart from I tell you, there were several experiences like this. The first one was Revenge of the Cybermen, when that came out on video for the first time, which is the first VHS.
Yeah.
I remember I had to go to a rehearsal. I was in sixth form when I was doing a play, and I put it in, and there was the first 50 minutes of it, which were quite good. And I thought, oh yeah, that's quite like I remember it. And then coming back and being increasingly appalled as it gradually got further and further away. This was another one. The worst one was the arc in space, because the arc in space in my memory was as visceral and as terrifying as Ian Marter made it in the novelization. And he, although I love that novelization, I've talked about that elsewhere, he did that story no favors by turning it into Ridley Scott's Alien 2 years before it came out, with Noah's head exploding like a seed pod. So when I saw it in 85, I didn't sleep the night that episode 2 of Ark in Space went out, because I was so frightened when Noah took his hand out of his pocket and believed that man was being consumed by this flesh-eating monster. I didn't sleep the night I saw it again, 1995, because I was so disappointed. And there's a terrible sort of like eviscerating sort of humiliating feeling that can happen to me a few times with Doctor Who. There are other stories. Sea Devils looked exactly as I'd remembered it almost.
Yeah.
Frontier in Space, pretty much. Various other stories. A lot of them lived up to my memories. But the ones that didn't, it took a while for me to go back and come to terms with on their own terms, as it were. But once I did, I'd expiated the horror of it not living up to the memory, and I go back
personal,
to,
isn't it?
Yeah, and it's one I go back to and I find very comforting to watch. And again, it became a great favorite of my son's, so we'd watch it together, you know. But his favorite story is my favorite story, which is wonderful, which is The Seeds of Doom. So that was a joy to see Doctor Who. Again, that transcending the barriers of generations, watching Doctor Who through the eyes of another child, or seeing a child relating to it just as we did, and then getting older and realizing it's more sophisticated than just something that's scary with monsters, you know.
And the way I look at it is that's how it should be, because, you know, to answer your question, yeah, the next time I saw it after original transmission was, yes, with the VHS release that Dan, you were talking about from the late 80s. And yes, Stephen, it was a huge disappointment because it had seared into my brain so much. And to say, I passionately feel that was my awakening with Doctor Who in many ways, Death to the Daleks. So yeah, it was very, very disappointing. But and here's the counter to that, which is, as you said, with your own son, he fell in love with Death to the Daleks, and so he's seeing it in the same way that I was seeing it when I was younger. And we've all said this, that Doctor Who fires your imagination, and we've all talked about things that we misremembered from Doctor Who because we thought there were a million Krynoids or 1,000 Wirren or whatever it was. We misremembered it as something bigger than it actually was. Now that, to me, that's really crucial, because if Doctor Who can do that, if Doctor Who can fire the imagination that you think it's far better than you actually watched on screen, that's an absolute result as far as I'm concerned. And so although I come back to it now and it doesn't live up to what I imagined Death of the Daleks was when I was 6, it doesn't matter, because in my brain I've still got those memories that fired my imagination when I was 6. And so that's got to, isn't that one of the best things about Doctor Who, that it can inspire you?
Oh yeah,
the show
remember
is
something as being better than it was.
This show is an inspiration, and it is a gift with a magic all of its own that I don't think I'll ever be able to quite nail it down. It's been, I mentioned earlier on, it'd been 2 decades since I'd seen this story before, and so to come back to it after all that period of time and feel completely differently, it does feel like a vindication for me in my continued ridiculous belief and devotion to this show, Simon, in many ways, exactly as you've just described, because here I am as a man about to enter middle age. A middle age.
A long way away yet, surely, Dan. A long way away.
Thank you, Stephen. So here I am now, all these decades on. Never mind from when it was first broadcast, since I first saw it on VHS, and to feel completely differently about it. I was engrossed in this.
Wow.
Right from the very first scene, and almost from start to finish too. If I'm honest, my attention started to waver in episode 4. I'm not sure why. I'd have to go back and probably watch it again to work out why. But yeah, it did start to drop a touch. Maybe there were too many plates spinning. I don't know.
Maybe it's because the plot goes in episode 4. There is no plot in episode 4.
It does seem to sort of just evaporate. And the things that I was hanging on to see what, and we do get moments when Galloway gives his life. You know, we get bones thrown us like that. It doesn't quite deliver on the first 3. But I was enjoying episode 1 so much, in fact, that by the time the Daleks showed up, I'd forgotten the Daleks were meant to be in the thing. It just wrapped itself around me, this story. The city, I'd forgotten how haunting it is to look at.
Yeah, the city,
and all that talk as well. I mean, obviously, even that is totemic as well, and it represents several civilizations from Earth history, doesn't it? And the Doctor has that moment with it's with Bilal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it with Bilal where he says, "Oh, there's a place on
Peru.
Earth that's just like this in Peru," and you in a moment he's explaining it so beautifully. You can picture it in a textbook that you might have read at school. You go, oh yeah, and then they just leave it there. They don't try and explain it, and they would now. They would go to great lengths to explain that now.
You get a flashback sequence and all manner of things.
They just leave it hanging there like a nugget, as if we don't need it. But all this is monument to this civilization that's been dead for centuries, and that's never not affecting in itself, because we all realise that history forgets everybody eventually, doesn't it? Pertwee, who I've established is probably my least favourite of the classic Doctors. Not necessarily for anything that he's doing. It's more what he's not doing in line with the character that I grew up with. But in this, I've gone on a 30-year mission of discovery with the Third Doctor, Stephen. So I'm now at a place where I understand him, I recognise him as the Doctor, and I'm starting to appreciate with every revisit of a Pertwee story, because I've seen them all the way through 3 or 4 times. But every time I go back to one, I see something else. Pertwee is incredibly commanding in this. His take on the character is complete, fully rounded out. He's totally in line with it. Any lack of, if he ever felt that he wasn't right for the show or didn't know why he was taking it, why they wanted him, all that is just gone. Perhaps the chemistry between him and Liz Sladen isn't quite there yet at this point. But then again, they get separated for large amounts of it. So I think that's probably hard to say too. But generally speaking, I think the fact that Death of the Daleks itself is so thick with atmosphere is it's big. I think that's its power. I think that's why it swept me away. It's why I'll probably be rewatching this one sooner rather than later. It's not going to be another 20 years.
what I now, regardless of my my petulant teenage disappointment peak with something that didn't live up to my infantile imagination's take on it. What I now realize is, and always strikes me with every Doctor Who story, and some of them are more successful and some of them are so astonishingly accepted. I'm going to be talking about Genesis of the Daleks with some people on Friday, and that never ceases to stagger me on every level. But even a story like this, which, as we've all agreed, isn't the greatest Doctor Who story of all time. When you think of
molds,
but when you think of the conditions they were making these things on, and that they had to get 25 minutes in 3 hours, etc., all the things that we know, because we know all the minutiae of we practically know the minutes of every meeting now, don't some of us? That is it's just it boggles my mind how good it was, even on the worst of bad days for it, that they managed to make it that good on that budget in that time under those circumstances.
And I think
just astonishing.
And I think the thing with Death of the Daleks is that some stories don't look as though they were necessarily trying that hard to do it. Death of the Daleks, I think, does. I think it looks, as you were saying earlier, Dan, with the way the Exelons, that they thought about those costumes to make them look like they were made out of rock. They thought about the route and how that was a very difficult special effect to pull off. They thought about the city. We've talked about the red and white checkerboard. That it looks to me like that there was a lot of effort poured into this story. They were trying their absolute best with it, as they do with most classic, but not all classic Doctor Who. But this one they were. I think.
For my money, that I don't think there's a Pertwee story where they're not.
I think you're probably right, actually.
That is an era. It's to do with, it comes from Barry Letts, I think.
Of course, and Terence Dix.
And Terence Dix and the directors that they surrounded themselves with, who most of them had come up, of course, through, they'd worked on Doctor Who, they cut their teeth as production assistants, and they'd come to fruition. They come into their prime as so you've got David Maloney, you've got Michael Bryant, you've got early ones Timothy, you've got Douglas Camfield, and it's in the Pertwee era and the Hinchcliffe years that group of directors, and it's quite a tight group, are delivering astonishing work.
What I noticed about this, is that for when we look back at the Troughton era, and you look at a story like The Invasion as a kind of blueprint for what would be done in the Pertwee era. Yeah. In some respects, me watching this now, what I see in its various constituent parts, its atmosphere, the production values, the way it makes me feel, the Doctor's relationship to its companion, and that Hammer-esque quality. I was surprised how much there's still Daleks gliding around, but I hadn't noticed before how much this story in particular points the way to the future of the show, how it would evolve over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, with all those big changes that were about to be wrong. Is it rang or wrong? I'll go for both.
Wrong.
I was right the first time. To be wrong. So for me, this is it's my only serious rival now to the Time Warrior as the best of season 11, and it represents a major rediscovery for me. I'm going to give this 4 roots out of 5. I agree with you, Stephen. I think it's very, very solid, and I reserve the right to raise that score too at a later date, because I do that all the time as well.
So interestingly, what would you think you would have given it, Dan, if you hadn't watched it as you have done recently for this?
I'd have given it,
your memories alone of having watched it previously on VHS.
I'd have given it a 2 at a push. And I think that's a reason why. I've also given this such a wide berth, is because I thought, I don't want to see Doctor Who looking that shoddy and see. I don't know. It's to my shame that I haven't watched it in so long. Now I feel like I've wasted my time watching other stories over and over again. The ratings for this story were between 8.1 million. That was for episode 3. No, beg your pardon. The ratings, the lowest rating for episode 1 was 8.1 million, but the highest was episode 3, and that was 10.5 million.
Wow.
That's a big number.
Is that the highest
like that.
rating for season 11 all told? Was that the highest? The highest.
I couldn't tell you, but it's got to be up there, isn't it? It's
One of
gotta be
the
up there.
highest, I would have thought. It's definitely one of the highest.
Bankability.
Yeah, because that
bankability of the Daleks.
Because it wasn't getting 10s a lot, was it? Until Tom, I think
No.
it was getting 8s and 9s, wasn't it? On a good day, as I recall.
Yeah, consistently. And of course, the interesting thing about Death of the Daleks is we've talked about Barry Letts and how he really cemented the Pertwee years. Whether you like them or not, that they are absolutely. They are Barry Letts' vision. And it was during just as Death of the Daleks was completing production, that he announced to the cast and crew that he was stepping down. So interestingly, this story marks the beginning of the end of that era, right. Because it wasn't long after that.
Pertwee decides afterwards, doesn't it?
Correct. It wasn't long after that.
That Christmas, I think, isn't it? As they just
shortly afterwards.
The highest rated story of this season was Invasion of the Dinosaurs. Interestingly,
how strange.
And well, let me see. I think Invasion of the Dinosaurs, if they got the dinosaurs right, is an incredibly good story.
I agree.
As a story.
I agree.
It's a shame about the dinosaurs.
It's down to the budget, but then in many ways, maybe Death of the Daleks is also down to the budget, because had they invested in some new Daleks, because let's be honest, those Daleks really do look shoddy by this point,
aren't they? Yeah,
they're very tatty, and so had they invested in some good Daleks and some better sets, maybe it does just suffer a little bit from the budget problem, just a bit too much. Perhaps.
I think Time Warriors is the strongest story of this.
Yeah, I think so.
Would that be your voice as well, Dan? Yeah.
I haven't. There are some of the other stories. I think I've only ever seen Invasion of the Dinosaurs. I think I've only ever seen it twice. I'm going to have to go back to that one as well.
It's a cracker.
Yeah, I've given that. It didn't make any impression on me either other time. And I've just had no real reason to go back to it since because I've done the 2 watch throughs all the way through since the tapes and things came out. So I'll probably have to reconnect with that one. With that one next, I've got the DVD upstairs. But this came out on VHS. As we said.
Yeah, maybe we can come back and talk about that.
I think that would be really, really cool. So the VHS tape that I had all those years ago, that came out in 1987, and they cut it up in an omnibus form. So there was stuff missing and minus the credits and things like that. They thought we wanted classic Doctor Who in movie form, didn't they? The fools! It did come out unedited in 1995 on VHS, and then on DVD finally in 2012. It's still available now as well. We're waiting on the Blu-ray at some point in the near future.
Strangely, though, there were edits in the later VHS version that weren't in cuts. That I know that obviously it cuts out all the cliffhangers in the first VHS, but there were bits missing in the re-released VHS which had the cliffhangers, and this puzzled me for some years. And then I found out it's because they used the Australian tapes.
Oh, I see.
So they got censorship cuts. Yeah. So I think it was a shot of Belle-Al's face. And there was a line of Pertwee. And Pertwee she says, "Who are you fooling?" And he says, "Myself chiefly." Myself chiefly wasn't in it. I remember because I knew it so well from the first release. And suddenly there was this line missing. So that was all these funny little anomalies of different incarnations of things.
It's still available on disc. If you'd rather wait for the Blu-ray, I can see why people do. But it is out there if you've got a burning desire to see this. And of course, it's streaming on ITVX at the moment in Britain. I think that you can still get it on BritBox. Elsewhere in the world, Doctor Who is actually classic. Doctor Who is in more places than ever now. Pluto TV also shows all the classic stuff too. So yeah, it's out there. It's in circulation. Talking about memories, I'm going to prompt you about this, Stephen, because we talked about this before we started the show, and yet we've forgotten about it after all. So you remember, I don't know if you were actually watching it or whether you were hopping between channels at the time, but you talked to me about the Tomorrow People earlier on. The Tomorrow People aired. It was airing opposite Doctor Who at this time, wasn't it? Or near enough, or on the same evening. Where was it?
It was on Mondays.
It's on Monday.
On Thames, or because we got Granada, but it was nationally networked. And I remember the one that was on when Death, because I watched it originally because I was obsessed with the music, which of course
we all were.
Dudley sort of distilling sort of the sort of the spookiest elements of his incidental music into a title theme, which was quite so brilliantly. But the one that was on at this time was called The Blue and the Green.
Yeah, which is one of the most famous ones.
It is, and it's one I vividly remember.
Yeah,
and I associate with because you associate things with other things that were on at the same time.
And it's very clever. It's very clever. It's a political allegory. The Blue and the Green, isn't it?
It's
really sophisticated.
A brilliant political allegory. Yeah.
It's really
about people affiliating themselves because we need to be members of teams without any reason other than we need to be members of teams.
Correct.
To be on one side or another. So one lot are sort of passionately devoted to the color blue and on one side to the color green. It's like football, isn't it? So my team. well, why? Just because it is,
There was a friendly sort of rivalry, wasn't it? The Thames ITV were always trying to topple Doctor Who, if not literally from the schedules on that evening, then in terms of popularity. And the Tomorrow People ran for a long time. It was probably their best effort, wasn't it? Their best homespun effort at doing just that.
It does. There's no two ways about it. The Tomorrow People does look like a poor relation to Doctor Who. We've just talked about budget restrictions on Doctor Who. Wow, I really think they made it with 20 pence in a bag of crisps, to be honest, the Tomorrow People. But I still absolutely adore it. I love it. The theme tune is, I still think, the best. I think it tops Doctor Who for me personally. I think it's the finest theme tune of all time. Seriously, do. It's just
it is a good one. Yeah, it's really good
piece of music. And I love the Tomorrow People. It's just that the atmosphere is great. The characterization is great. The stories are great. It's just needed more money. Simple as that. And I think had they put more money into it, it would have been bigger than it was. Because yes, it was big, but it didn't last. It didn't endure in the same way that Doctor Who has. And I think he could have done. I think he had every opportunity to, but it needed a bit more money.
Same old stories. It's same old tune. The third Doctor would return to the series eventually in 1983 as part of the 5 Doctors with Sarah back at his side, played by Liz Sladen again, and they would repeat that on audio too in 2 later adventures, wouldn't they? The Ghosts of N-Space and the Paradise of Death on BBC Radio 4, I think that was. So yeah, even though it's Joe Grant that we associate the third Doctor with more so, they did continue to work together and evolve that relationship where and whenever they could. But the third Doctor himself, as I say, is a character that I still feel like I'm discovering. But Jon Pertwee himself is someone that I've always had unending affection for, respect for, and enjoyed in practically everything I've ever seen him in. I'm constantly finding new things to enjoy in this characterization. And so I think that whilst I do see when people roll their eyes sometimes when I say, the Pertwee era is my least favourite, as if it's the most ridiculous thing anybody could ever say. But in my defence, I've got there with it slowly. And that journey, I think, was particular to me and one that I have had to make. And I've held the course and been very rewarded by it.
Well, what's fascinating is, this series has been going on for 60 years. It's gone through so many different eras and tonal sort of variations. It's fascinating, isn't it? That you can meet a fan who is a fan of the same program, and they might as well be a fan of a completely different program. But there's something about the thing, an essential, quintessential sort of ethos of the thing that binds us all together. And it's always a mistake, I think, which is quite easily done, and I've done it in the past. So if somebody hates your favorite story, you can take it quite personally. But I'm trying to get maturer than that these days. And but there is, I suppose, there are certain moments in one's experience as a fan when one was deeply offended by what the show did. Warriors of the Deep was the moment for me that was unforgivable, because my first memory was the Sea Devils, and you know, it's still one of the worst days of my life.
Isn't that funny? Because I love Warriors of the Deep. Absolutely.
But you see, this is now, I'm now big enough to hear that.
We're going to have to get him on for a Warriors of the Deep review now. Yes, so
just to distract from that moment, I just want to do this. Anyway.
Whoa! Is that your ringtone?
No, I've just drummed it up on YouTube.
Brilliant!
It is the most remarkable piece of music.
It is. It's magnificent. It's magnificent.
Awesome stuff. And so, yeah, as magnificent as the Third Doctor was and is, I think every one of these classic incarnations now has this life of their own, which has carried on after the lifespan of the actor who originally brought him to life. And it's the same with the Third Doctor, created, embodied by Jon Pertwee, who clearly brought so much of himself that he'd been holding back after all those years in playing, in being under the green umbrella that he always talks about in interviews. And the legacy now continues, doesn't it, with Tim Treloar voicing the Third Doctor for Big Finish Productions. There's several, I think he's been doing it for the best part of 10 years. So he's deep into that, box set after box set, release after release. And I'm sure that Jon Pertwee would be proud of that, to think that part of him and something that he created from within himself. I don't know if it was against the odds, but I think that Pertwee couldn't quite believe it himself, that it has happened, that it's endured in the way that it has. He redefined the character of the Doctor and left the series in a far better place than when he'd arrived. I think that's a fair point to say. And nothing against Troughton.
That's undeniable. I'd have thought, yes, and it isn't anything against Troughton, but it was, you know, it looked like it was absolutely on its last legs, didn't it?
Yeah.
In 69.
By the time Pertwee was departing, it was back to being an unmovable fixture, I suppose, just like the football results of Saturday evening television. And I think it would have probably been unthinkable for anybody at the BBC to even consider giving it a long rest or replacing it with something else. Trying to do it's, you know, there was no question of it continuing.
I think the thing is
Pertwee.
I think the thing is Patrick Troughton. Bringing Patrick Troughton in, replacing the First Doctor, was an experiment that might or might not have worked. But by the time we get to Jon Pertwee, it's established. It's become a success. It is solid. The idea of regeneration and switching to a new actor is established and accepted and expected. And so I think all of those formative 6 years under Hartnell and Troughton just all coalesce and come together in the Pertwee years. And that's not just because of Pertwee, it is because of Barry Letts and Terence Dix as well. And they consolidate the work that was done in the first 6 years, and they basically establish Doctor Who as a brand that is not going to be going anywhere for many, many years to come.
I suppose the biggest question, Simon, was how on earth could you possibly follow that? But that's definitely a story for another time. Jon Pertwee remained closely associated with the role of the Doctor for the rest of his life. I don't know if that frustrated him or not. Yeah, I think he very much accepted it by the end and started to understand the Doctor too. And he was still a presence on British television, lots of variety shows and chat shows, and the Ultimate Adventure Stay Show, and all these things. Jon Pertwee was the consummate entertainer, wasn't he? He was never not being Jon Pertwee. He loved mugging for the camera. I think he relished the fact when he realized that people had grown up watching him. I think he knew that there was a weight to that, and if not a burden, then probably a responsibility. And I never met him myself. I wish that I had. Particularly now that I see his Doctor in a completely different light. But in my view, characters like Jon Pertwee and a lot of the people who were on those sort of radio shows. But Leslie Phillips died only about a year ago. People of that generation, I think Leslie was probably the last one. And it's sort of sad that they're not still around. That versatility and that playfulness. Jon Pertwee, for all he was a very masculine man, wasn't he? Very famously masculine, and yet you catch him in a moment, and he looked like he was a a naughty schoolboy who was waiting to be found out. And I think you just see that every now and again with Pertwee himself, even if you never got that from the Third Doctor. And I think that's testimony to how fine an actor Jon Pertwee, how fine a straight actor he could be. I don't think he ever got on the right page with the Daleks, but then again, no.
Well, you see, I think in many
everything.
ways maybe the reason he was so anti the Daleks was because they were bigger than him, and he famously had run-ins with. He didn't like the fact that Delgado, the character of the Master, was becoming more popular than the Doctor, and I think there's a degree of rivalry there that made him a little bit grumpy about the Daleks.
I wonder how he must have felt, in the 4 years before he got Wurzel Gummidge or got off the ground. It must have been so difficult for somebody like him to go through to see the next Doctor being even more successful than he.
Yeah, sure.
I think it was.
It is undeniable that nobody's ever been as successful as Tom Baker as the Doctor, with the possible exception of David Tennant in the revised series. But that must have been difficult for somebody like Pertwee.
I would imagine that Wurzel Gummidge, which he didn't have to share with anybody. He didn't have to see Mackenzie.
Well, he said, when asked which do you prefer, he said, "Well, I prefer Wurzel because it was my own thing.
Yes.
There's only one. There was. Now they've remade it, but it was my creation. I didn't create Doctor Who because he didn't write the books of Wurzel Gummidge, but it was entirely his own at that time." Characterization, whereas he shared Doctor Who with other people, and of course most probably teeth grindingly with Tom Baker in the aftermath of
well, especially seeing as he hadn't even really wanted to leave the whole book.
No,
stay on in Doctor Who.
I know.
The things we do. We're going to continue talking through reviews of classic and new Doctor Who. It's all one series to us here at Type 40. We're going to make our way through it, not necessarily in the right order, but in a kind of order. All those incarnations here on Type 40 in our Diamond season of reviews. We're going to get together and chat with people that we've known for a while, or sometimes people that we don't. People who are going to come on new, and mixes of people and voices and opinions that I'd say not only have you not heard before, but you probably don't get anywhere else. But that's the old girl starting up and calling time on yet another edition of Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast. I'll be back with another one soon. Of course I will. Look out for that wherever you found this. It could have been at the dedicated home feed for Type 40 at type40.podbean.com. Maybe it rolled up on the podcatcher of your choice. So I'm talking about Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeart Radio, TuneIn, Google Play, Podbay, all those places. Plus, we're still on the fabulous Fandom Podcasts' own master feed, loaded up with all those treats for your ears. Never mind on the weekly. They've got it coming at you on the daily there at the Fandom Podcast Network. So please consider a trip sideways in time for more quality shows from the FPN. You can reach out to us through our social medias, Instagram or Twitter at Type 40 Doctor Who. Email us at type40doctorwho@gmail.com. And if you're feeling particularly brave, depends on how the mood may take you, you can find us on Facebook in the Type 40 Facebook group. That's where regenerations worth upon regenerations worth of Doctor Who fans from the classic era, from the new era, and people who are looking forward to all new Doctor Who. We're all congregating there and celebrating and speculating, all for the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who getting stuck in. So come and find us there on Facebook and join in with your takes. Stephen, it's been brilliant to have you on the show. You're a mine of information, as I suspected you may be. We went all over the map, but if people want to hear you as the first Doctor, there's a couple of box sets out already, aren't there? And you are part of their 60th anniversary range, aren't you? I know you can't talk about releases that could be to come, but these are the ones that are already out. So there's the Outlaws and the Demon Song there, and Once and Future Past Lives. I mean, I do hope we'll have to talk to you more about that and about audio drama and all sorts of other things. But most of all, I think I'd just love to hang out with you a bit more and talk about some more classic Doctor Who stories. I hope you're down.
I'd love to do that. It's been a joy today.
The correct answer, Simon.
Well, no, but it's an authentic, a sincere, and a truthful answer. No, it really is.
You're welcome back anytime. It's as always, it is a joy to speak classic Doctor Who with classic fans.
Yeah, there you go.
So, yeah, Simon, while I remember, give us your social media links as well. People can find you, hang out on Facebook, can't they?
Yeah, they can see me on Facebook under Doctor Who, The Whonatics, WHONATICS. Come and say hello there and join in the fun.
And you can find me on Instagram and Twitter as the Spacebook, wheezing and groaning, ranting and raving about all things geeky inside and outside of the TARDIS. And now and again, I talk about the odd bit of real life too, and share other things when the mood takes me. So yeah, come and find me on social media and let me know what you think of all this. If you're watching on YouTube, drop us a comment. Give us your review of our review. We're all ears. And you can speculate too about what's to come on the next of these Diamond Anniversary reviews of classic and new Doctor Who, all in the mix. Not quite sure where we're going. Well, I've got a fair idea where we're going yet, but you know what this thing's like. It could all change in the flick of a switch. So yet again, Stephen Noonan, Simon Horton, thank you for your company on this one. And thanks to you for watching. Thanks for listening. We always have the time. If you have the space here at Type 40, but that's it for another one. Take care. We'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.